Om Shri Sai Ram. With humility and love, I offer myself at Swami's Divine Lotus Feet. Respected faculty from the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science, Sri Sathya Institute of Higher Learning. Respected and dear research scholar brothers, dear student brothers, and dear brothers and sisters who have joined us virtually for this Indo-US conference. We formally welcome you to this Indo-US conference. We begin this conference with the traditional lighting the lamp ceremony and Veda chanting. I request Senior Professor Dr. K. Sridharan to do the needful. And also I request Dr. Pallav Kumar Barwa and Dr. B.V.K. Bharadwaj to join for this session. Now we'll have the traditional Vedam chanting session.
कवीनामुपमश्रवस्तमम् ज्येष्ठराजम् ब्रह्मणस्पत आनः शृण्वन्नोतिभिः सीदसादनम् प्रणो देवी सरस्वती वाजेभिर्वाजिनीवती धीनामभित्रयवतु गणेशाय नमः सरस्वत्यै नमः श्रीगुरुभ्यो नमः हरिः ओम् भद्रम् कर्णेभिः शृणुयाम देवाः भद्रम् पश्येमाक्षभिर्यजत्राः स्थिरैरङ्गैस्तुष्टुवागुंसस्तनूभिः व्यशेम देवहितं यदायुः स्वस्ति न इन्द्रो वृद्धश्रवाः स्वस्ति नः पूषा विश्ववेदाः स्वस्ति नस्तार्क्ष्यो अरिष्टनेमिः स्वस्ति नो बृहस्पतिर्दधातु शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः.
Om Shri Sai Ram. So now it's my pleasant duty to give the welcome remarks for this Indo-US conference too. So initially, before going to the genesis of this series of Indo-US workshops and conference, I would like to quote our founder chancellor Bhagavan Sri Sathya Baba's statement about the research. In the field of science today, there is a great emphasis on research and discovery. But unless the results of research are applied in practice, it will be an expensive futility. If all the time is spent on research, when is it to find useful application in practice? Nor is there any sense of discrimination in the promotion of research. Those engaged in research seem to have more concern about boosting their name and fame by their research rather than about the exact research. Nor do they seem to be bothered about the harmful consequences of their discoveries. So the end line actually kind of acts as a guidepost to the research that is happening at SSIHL, to be specific at Department of Mathematics and Computer Science, which says that the scientific knowledge we acquire must be useful for the benefit of our fellow men and to the society. So this has been a direction for the entire university, that societal research, which is the need of the hour, which actually comes from the interdisciplinary research, has been a kind of a guiding factor for the research that happens at DMAX. So coming back to the genesis of this Indo-US workshop or conference series, it all started when I was at University of Arizona, Tucson, in 2017 in the month of October. So I was there to present this for this conference to present my research work, which was majorly dealing with ecology and epidemiology. So there I had the good chance. Maybe I would say it's the blessing of our divine founder chancellor. I had an opportunity to meet Dr. Anuj Mubai. So from there, the kind of this series has this workshop and conference series has originated. So we had rounds of discussion. Sir was Dr. Anuj Mubai. He was very keen to conduct a workshop at in India, specifically at our university. So we had kind of discussions, and finally the kind of we took the fruition in 2018 in the month of August from 12th to 15th, where we called this first Indo-US workshop as MOTSIP 1. So here are the some of the proceedings or some of the sessions that we conducted. It's a brief report where you can see we have invited right here in this place where I'm standing now. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19 pandemic, we cannot have physically. We are having this conference virtually, but right here we had this first Indo-US workshop conference series. As you can see there, we have the plenary speaker as Castello Chavez, who is a pioneer in the field of ecology and epidemiology. To the right, you can see at the down of the slide, you can see Dr. Anuj Mubai giving the introductory remarks. So you can also see that there are few international speakers, Professor Padmanabhan Seshayar from George Mason University and also Professor Grillo. Then, of course, I also had the opportunity to give a lecture in that workshop. And we have few more, maybe Professor Ratish Kumar from IIT Kanpur giving a lecture. So at the end, you can see we have people from IIT Patna, and also we had a few contacts from CLTRI, which is situated in Chennai, Central Leprosy Teaching and Research Institute. So we can see the speakers and the organizing committee photographs at the end. So what is the outcomes or collaborations from this workshop? So we started slowly, but of course we continuously are moving ahead. So this led to a strong collaboration with faculty from IIT Patna, where we have worked and we have few publications in the field of epidemiology. And also we have a very strong collaboration, and also as initially why I mentioned that quote of Bhagwan has really helped us to have a collaboration with Central Leprosy Teaching and Research and Training Institute, wherein we wanted to kind of reduce, at least in maybe because most of us are mathematicians, an epsilon suffering of the lepers. If you have physically seen, it's so painful to see the lepers. So through our knowledge, through mathematics, can at least an epsilon of the suffering of the lepers, if we can reduce, that will be a great satisfaction for the research work which we have been doing. So the collaboration has started, and we identified few areas which we wanted to work. And we have recently got a project from the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, CSIR. So we have been working on the lepra reactions, we are studying the optimal drug regimen more as and when our department presents the mathematical modeling group of the department. Maybe tomorrow morning session you can see that. So we are trying to work on the lepra reactions and how to reduce the lepra reactions. So that's the takeaway from Indo-US workshop MOTSIP 1. So then when things were just started and we are moving ahead, COVID-19 came as a pause, which actually in every sense, it's a shocker, and it has made us think in many ways. Though the world has stopped, the research didn't stop. The research, actually the most happening thing of COVID-19 pandemic was the research. So the research in every front, research in the mathematical modeling, especially the prediction modeling, when we will have the first wave, or when do we have the second wave, when do we flatten the curve, or what is the possible best vaccine, and what is the efficacy of vaccines, and how many should be vaccinated so that the death percentage comes down, infection percentage comes down. all those things we need to we actually in fact have uh, checked that. Okay, so based on that, we thought that we should have a conference regarding this COVID-19 pandemic, as it is apt, as lot of research has been done in this area in the COVID-19 pandemic. So at present, especially in India, I'm speaking with respect to the Indian context, third wave has not fully taken over, and we are, I would say, maybe with my, it's my kind of an understanding that we are not out of control, we are within control at the moment. So this is a right time for us to take stock of what is the research that is happening in the COVID-19 front, what has happened, and what should be our way ahead. So how should the research should go on further. So motivated by that, or based on the above things, we titled this conference, and we also felt it's a time, since we had the past conference in 2000, past workshop in fact in 2018. So this conference we wanted to have on COVID-19 pandemic. It's like an up to date, what is the stock that has happened earlier, and what, how should we look at in the future. So we have titled this conference as the science of mathematical modeling and decision making, a changing trajectory into the future from past to post COVID-19 pandemic. So the present conference, we have around approximately around 24 speakers and 200 participants approximately from different parts of the globe. We have participants and maybe speakers also from West Indies, Amsterdam, of course from India and USA, Peru, Spain. You would have seen in the flyer. So we have different speakers and different participants. So in its sense, in its true sense, it's an international conference, not only Indo-US conference. So with this, I would request now Dr. Anuj Mubai, who is the co-convener and co-organizer for this Indo-US conference, to tell more about the present conference and how should we take ahead. What is the road ahead, or what are the future plans for this conference, or how should we go about for this Indo-US conference and workshop series. Thank you all for your patient listening. Over to Dr. Anuj Mubai.
Well, thank you, Dr. Vamsi Dasu. Let me share my little screen if I can.
Sir, can you share your screen? Did you share the screen?
Yeah, hold on 1 second. I'm just opening. Yeah. Now, can you see my screen? Can you see my screen, Dr. Vamsi Dasu?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's pleasure to welcome all of you, the participants, the speakers, and people joining from different continents. Greetings. It's morning here in India, but evening in North America and South America, and Europe maybe earlier in the day. So. Well, Dr. Vamsi Dasu has already given a brief background on this. I am actually affiliated with Precision HUR, which is Health Economics and Outcome Organization, and also Illinois State University Center for Collaborative Study in Mathematical Biology. It's directed by Professor O.J. Yakman. He's Executive Director of Intercollegiate Biomathematics Alliance. And with that organization, actually, we were able to jointly work with Sri Sathya Institute of Higher Learning. So it's an amazing collaborations, and we are looking forward to many different activities, not only today's conference, which you will going to see the activities for the next 3 days. So before I go further on what I want to say about this conference, I want to dedicate this all the activities that we are doing in honor of Professor Fred Breuer, who passed away just recently. I knew him very dearly. He's actually my postdoctoral, sorry, not postdoctoral, my academic grandfather. so my advisor's advisor. He was 89 years old when he passed away. He was an emeritus professor at University of British Columbia, Vancouver. For number of years, he was faculty at University of Wisconsin Madison, very well-known institution, and his pioneered in dynamical system. And later in his research work, he worked on mathematical epidemiology and population biology models, which is kind of partly a focus of today's conference as well. Um, he was aggressively publishing papers until 2020. Actually, in 2020, he cited almost, his work has been cited like 1600 times. His very well-known book, Mathematical Models in Population Biology and Ecology, along with Professor Carlos Castillo Chavez, has been very popular in the scientific literature. So, with that dedication and honor, he has been an amazing inspirations for many of us here in this field. So again, I just want to touch base about this previous workshop in 2018 and that Dr. Vamsi Dasu and Dr. Pallav Kumar and also Dr. Padmanabhan Sheshyar. Along with them, we organized this conference, which had a tremendous success at various ends. It is not only the research that we are promoting, it is also the how to build a community of researchers who can continuously access each other's help or skills on an ongoing basis. Dr. Vamsi Dasu mentioned few of the accomplishment, but there were many other accomplishment also, like having collaborations like Public Health Institute of India. Actually, it is called PHFI, Public Health Foundation of India. We built up the relationship with them, and Central Leprosy Teaching Institute also, like as Dr. Vamsi Dasu was mentioning. But more to that is different types of teaching methodology, pedagogical techniques that different places uses to train, and we learned through that workshop. So it was a comprehensive professional building rather than just research promotion. So it was quite a good success. Unfortunately, due to COVID outbreak, we were unable to do it for last year or so. But we continued this year, and we hope to continue in future as well. So, what is the focus of today's conference? As Dr. Vamsi Dasu was mentioning, well, COVID has shown us an unprecedented challenges never seen before. Uh, so, of course, there was medical challenges, there were logistic challenges for teaching, for example, but there was also modeling challenges, because if you say that it was medical needs were the most important, but the medical needs cannot go if we don't have method technologies to understand those medical implications. So I think the modeling, we realized that we were unprepared in actually the modeling tools and techniques. There were lots of challenges, like existing models were not sufficient, they were not adapting to the changing data. Forecasting techniques were not very good, at least not good in the sense that they were not able to on the timely basis able to tackle the or help with the situations. There were lots of mortality in the populations, and decision making was, people the higher up in the administration, decision making were not believing on some of the results, because there were a lot of spectrum of modeling results that were coming, and so it was not very clear which more modeling results to take. But then there are some benefit also has happened. There are shifting trends have happened in opportunities, type of work that we should focus on nowadays. Post COVID, we will not do many of the things that we used to do pre-COVID, for examples, like online teaching. Now we are now got so many different tools for online teaching, for examples, and it's scientific community have grown quite a. And interdisciplinary collaborations have been encouraged quite a lot during this pandemic time. So there are some benefits that has come across due to this COVID, but there are also has been some challenges. Well, the main focus of this, characteristics of the today's conference, or in the next 3 days, what you will be seeing is, of course, interdisciplinary talks and discussion. People work in different parts of the world. They have a different way of doing things. So how are they doing it? Can we learn something that we can adapt to our um, in our way of teaching or way of doing modeling work, for example? And also, some way can we build a community of some sort? We want to make this community much stronger, whether it is to the social media, whether it is to the email communication. We know who to approach if we have a challenge of any mathematical challenges, computational challenges, statistical challenges, even jobs and career opportunities. If we have those challenges, who should we approach? And they will. That's the reason we have different types of speakers in our conference, and we have carefully crafted the set of speakers. They are pioneer in their areas, whether they are in India, whether they are in US or elsewhere, in Spain, in Peru. So they are amazing group of scientists, and you will hear different perspective that maybe sometimes we only stick to a perspective of our local institutes or local departments, for example. We also have a panel discussion where we can ask our questions. So it would be amazing to talk. And we have industry speakers also in that. One of the panelists is industry. One of the panelists is from Drug Institute. So there are lots of variation in this, and the hope is to we see the problems in a comprehensive way, because real life is a real life problems are very challenging. We cannot do it by one discipline or one method. It has to be tackled based on the problem by problem, and the method should be appropriately chosen based on the problem itself. Um, of course, this it's amazing that Sri Sathya Institute of Higher Learning, they have done amazing job behind the scenes to organize this thing. And there is a YouTube channel which is basically all the time will be running the live broadcast of the sessions here. And one thing which is I would encourage all of you to think about is the submitting ideas for commentaries from research articles for special issues in a journal that is we are trying to do it through this conference. So I just want to quickly go over. My time is limited, to give you the way of thinking from the modeling perspective also. But this is a very good example. The free mode of transportation have changed in last 2 centuries, actually. In 20th century, the mode of transportation was our sole goal was to move from one place to another. That was the sole goal. And so what 20th century has done is every family now has a car. Almost most of the, if not all, every. And this is the first car that you are seeing in this picture. It was by Mercedes-Benz in 1886, which has a motor in it, and it was the first mode of. You were for free. This initially it was very selective people were using it, but now actually it's almost every family, especially in developed world, they have this car. In 21st century, the definition of mode of transportation has changed in many different ways. For example, it is now talking about environmental friendly. It is now talking about less space. And it is talking about mass transportation. For example, this is a shared car. In many places, these are being tried. The shared bus, basically, which is electric car, so environmental friendly. It has no driver, and it can take many people. So this is shared car has been used for transporting people from house to the bus stop or train stop. And there from, so it's very frequent. There are many places in Germany, for example, in Europe countries, in US also, people are been trying this thing. So this is the 21st century, which is taking less space and more environmental friendly. So today's definition, freedom mode of transportation is changed from what we had in the earlier 20th century. In future, we will see a different type of definition for the mode of transportation. It will be a multi-purpose utility. In this, basically, the machine is same, but the top portion is changed from a something to a car for the cargo versus to transporting the people. So it can be changed from like a truck um, uh, to the to the bus, basically. And it would the definition is now changed, and in future transportation this is what it looks like. It will not only take less space, but take the space wisely, because parking would be limited. In a same way, we have to see how the modeling has been changed in last century or so. It has drastically changed the way we look at the problem in modeling nowadays. In 50s and 60s, dynamical systems were very popular. Actually early on to that, in 60, 70, stochastic processes, Markov chains, they came into existence. And now it's a multi-agent individual based models that are coming into picture. The challenges are different. How do you do so? From dynamical system to today's multi-agent system, is taking into account different data sets. There are challenges are different. We have to realize those challenges, and the opportunities in the job markets have also changed. So it's not only that this is a toy example of a car, but I'm also trying to communicate the modeling work has also been transformed, and COVID has transformed it drastically, some of the aspect in it. So if I get a time later on sometime, I may want to give some slides that what I'm trying to communicate with that. So you can see the list of speakers from, as I said before, it's from epidemiology, public health, computational biology, you name the field. And we have biostatistics, very well known people from different areas, applied mathematics, of course. Um, but people who are field scientists, who how do they collect the data? You see, many times we take the data for our models from the published literature. We don't see the challenge behind it. If we don't see the challenge, we cannot put, for example, what is the measurement errors when we do statistical inference? What is the measurement errors in that? So those things are very key to understanding the linking models with the data, for examples. So how do you handle from a mathematics perspective large sets of data sets? For example, we are using social media data in the public health domain, and so on and so forth, to understanding epidemics. For example, vaccination implementation has been challenging. How can we help with that? So there are lots of challenges that we are saying. The new treatments of the COVIDs are coming. How effective they are, how cost effective they are. There are models, various types of models. So we have health economics also who are coming this time, and which is a different way of thinking. Health economics is very key. So we, from a mathematical models, we capture the trends and patterns of the disease. But on top of it is a cost. You cannot do anything. You cannot implement interventions until unless you take a cost. Cost is different in US versus in India, for example. There are different constraints, and if we just try to understand the dynamics, we are missing some components of the challenging problems of today's world. The cost is very, economic aspects is very, and then there is a behavior issues. So many times public health department implement interventions, and they fail to truly implement it because people don't accept it. And there are this acceptance, so you have to understand human behavior also. Intervention just saying this much is effective is not sufficient. The human behavior in hand going through the with the interventions are very key in that. So I think I want to stop here and welcome you all again to this conference, and I hope you guys, you all will have things to share with us from your background, and also learn from many of the things that activities that we plan in this conference. Please do send us questions, comments from time to time, and we will share with you an email address through which you can share your comments during the conference, and we will try to kind of give you the update responses to that. So please stay tuned to the activities in the next 3 days. So thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Vamsitasu.
Thank you, Dr. Anuj, for piquing the interest of every participant and every listener. We are everyone over here is looking forward, and everyone on the virtual medium also. We just want to first clarify: are you all able to hear us on the Teams? I guess it's all fine now. So we continue. We will have in the next 2-3 days many luminaries who will be speaking to us. To begin this conference, the inaugural address, we have our revered Vice Chancellor, Dr. Karani Sanjeevi. Dr. Sanjeevi has been at the Karolinska Institute, a medical university in Stockholm, Sweden, since 1989. Karolinska Institute is known for selecting and awarding Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine, and the institute was established in 1810. Professor Sanjeevi heads the Diabetes Immunology Research Group at the Center for Molecular Medicine and is affiliated to the Department of Medicine. His group's focus is on autoimmune diabetes. Dr. Sanjeevi has won several awards, and the most notable one was the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman Award from the Government of India for eminence in one's field or outstanding work, medicine. It is the highest honor conferred on persons of Indian origin by the Government of India in recognition of their achievements both in India and abroad. Professor Sanjeevi assumed charge as the 11th Vice Chancellor of the Sri Sathya Sai Institute of Higher Learning on 23rd November 2019. I now request Dr. Sanjeevi to address the gathering. Sairam.
My humble pranams at the lotus feet of Bhagwan. And I'm very much privileged to give a talk today at the Indo-US symposium that is organized by Vamsi Krishna from the Department of Mathematics at SSIHL. This is an important conference, and I'm privileged to give the inaugural address. We have done a lot of work on COVID at SSIHL. So what I thought I will do is to talk about the COVID work, and also in general about the COVID, where we have made quite a bit of progress. And it's more than 18 months since we started to have the COVID pandemic, and it has created quite a bit of fatigue in us. So we are all very keen when it will all end. And much of our research studies are focused on trying to find solutions to COVID and also give us a prediction model where and when it is likely to end. So my talk will be on COVID work at SSIHL in particular and COVID-19 in general. So what is COVID-19? COVID-19 is the disease caused by a virus called SARS-CoV-2 virus. So it's an RNA virus. In March 2020, WHO declared COVID-19 outbreak as a pandemic. The patients come to you presenting with fever, cough, shortness of breath, and tiredness. And the gold standard for making a diagnosis is to do an RT-PCR test from samples obtained either buccal or from the throat or from the nasal swab. And it's also possible to take a sample from the blood and measure for antibodies against the COVID virus. So you have a possibility to detect antigen and possibility to detect antibodies. And one of the fastest way of getting the antigen tested and antibody tested is through an assay called lateral flow assay. And a kit to do the antigen detection and antibody detection was developed at SSIHL. So what you see on the picture to the left are the cells, pneumocytes, from which the SARS-CoV-2 virus is getting released. So this is predominantly affecting cells in the lungs. So one of the way by which COVID can really kill people is to cause lung failure. So there are several therapeutic candidates that have been tried over the years. since the pandemic was declared, and hydroxychloroquine was one of them, which was an approved medicine by the Indian Council of Medical Research, not only for COVID prophylaxis, but also for COVID treatment in the initial phases. And ivermectin was one of the other candidates that's also identified by the Indian Council of Medical Research as a candidate for treating COVID-19 infections. So it also depends on at what stage in the COVID infection that you would like to intervene. So if it is as a prophylaxis, or if it is in the early part of the treatment, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, antivirals are all very, very useful. Whereas if it is in the late stage, where you have the antigen and antibody positive, where there are oxygen, where there are lung affected, where the oxygen uptake is diminished, steroids is another choice of drug. So one of the important aspects for COVID-19 is to detect the COVID-19 so that you know who is positive, who is negative. It's also possible nowadays that you might develop symptoms of COVID, but you might not be COVID positive, which means you need to have a proper diagnosis of COVID. And the detection kit that we have developed, which is the lateral flow assay kit, that has a very high sensitivity and specificity that will allow COVID to be detected at the fastest possible time, which will be about 10 to 12 minutes from the time the sample is taken. So the kit that we have developed at SSIHL is called Dual Rapid Test. It's an innovative integration of dual immuno sandwich assay in a conventional lateral flow assay. So it's highly reliable and specific, and it has the ability to determine the stage of COVID-2 infection. The test kits will have two strips. One of them is an antigen strip for the detection of antigen from the nasal or throat swab. And the second is the antibody strip for the detection of antibodies from the blood, serum, or plasma. So the antibodies it detects are both IgG and IgM antibodies. So it's very important to have both the tests performed so that it will be very useful in clinical decision making in COVID-infected patients. So if COVID antigen is positive and antibody test strip is negative, that means it's early infection. And if COVID antigen test is positive and COVID antibody test is also positive, that means it's late infection, probably second week of the infection. If antigen is negative and antibody is positive, then it means that this person is recovered from COVID or he has received the vaccination. If, of course, both antigen and antibody strips turn negative, that means the person is not infected with COVID at all. So this is a useful information that will allow the clinicians to make the right choice in terms of treatment. So if you look at the design and development of the kit, what you see on the right-hand side is the plastic casing on a paper strip. And what you see as is the sample loading compartment, where you put the nasal swab already in an extraction buffer, and you put few drops of it. And this would allow the drops to flow in a lateral way and interact with the antigen already embedded in the strip, so that you will find a reaction, and that reaction will be visible like a band on the paper. So the antigen detection strip uses 30 to 40 microliters of nasal swab or saliva or sputum in an extraction buffer for antigen detection. And the cartoon in the middle tells you how it works and how the positivity is detected. The same thing goes for antibody detection strip, where 10 microliters of whole blood, plasma, or serum for antibody detection is followed by 3 drops of lysis buffer. So you need to load the blood or serum or plasma into the dilution buffer, and then take the dilution buffer, 3 drops, and put it in the sample loading compartment, where you're likely to see 3 strips. One is the control strip, second is the antigen IgM antibodies, and third is the IgG antibodies. If you go to the antigen test strips, you will have a seed called control strip and a test strip, where you see the band, which means the antigen is positive. So we had submitted our test kits for the ICMR validation, which is the central government body that approves all the kits that are made by various players for testing it in patients. We have 80% sensitivity and 100% specificity, which means anybody whom we say is negative is 100% certain it's negative, whereas anybody whom we say is positive is something close to 81% positive, which is sometimes closer or as good as the RT-PCR. So we have been performing a lot of studies in relation to the sensors and chips and how we could use them in relation to making the COVID detection even more sensitive, even more specific. And the work is being carried out by Star Labs, headed by Dr. Sai Satish. And this is a paper which was accepted in a very high quality journal with a very high impact factor on surface plasmon coupled dual emission platform for ultra-fast oxygen monitoring after COVID-2 infection. So we have been doing a lot of molecular modeling, and all the molecular modeling studies were done at the Department of Mathematics. And this work purely belongs to the techniques developed by Vamsi Krishna. And in vivo mathematical modeling studies on COVID-19 detection have started quite some time ago, more than 13 or 14 months ago at SSIHL. And Dr. Vamsi Krishna has been instrumental in coming out with quite a good number of papers. And one of the papers that was published shows that if you combine hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis with the BCG vaccination, the prevention of COVID infection is quite optimal. And this is something that is very exciting from this particular study. It's important to know that the BCG vaccination is being given a clinical trial right now for COVID protection in Netherlands as well as in Australia. BCG vaccination is currently undergoing trial, where if you were to give BCG vaccination in adults, predominantly with the Danish or Copenhagen strain of BCG vaccination, there is a high level of protection against coronavirus infection. This is something that is very important that might also play a very complementary role if given along with the conventional COVID vaccines. And BCG vaccine primarily boosts up the innate immunity. So we've also done studies on low temperature and high isolation delay, how the ambient temperature in the atmosphere can influence the spread of COVID, and what kind of temperature that are really important, where COVID will spread and where COVID will not spread. And this is quite an important work carried out by Vamsi Krishna's group. So we have also done combination therapy, how optimal and how effective it is. And we have done control intervention strategies within between host and efficacy in the treatment and spread of COVID-19. Some of these works are really very interesting works, which many people have not yet done. And we have come out with such predictive models, which is something that will serve as a guideline for performing clinical studies to verify and validate all that we have shown in our modeling system. So mathematical modeling, especially in vivo modeling, is an important tool. And throughout this Indo-US conference, you are going to hear more and more about how useful and how effective this mathematical modeling is going to be. So where are we with regards to COVID-19? This is something that everybody is asking in this current world. So if you look at the current world situation as far as COVID-19 is concerned, this is a graph that is dated 18th of October from the European Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And all you see in different colors indicate the number of cases per 100,000 population. And India has got a very low count as of October 18. But if you look at the total cases, as I said in my first slide, 241 million patients infected, 4.5 million people died all over the world. And this is something that is stark and fearsome. And if you see the wave as far as the total number of cases on a weekly basis, you can see in the world right now, the total number of cases reported last week was slightly less than 3 million. Is the count all over the world if you take low as well as middle or high incidence countries in the world. And this is the data as of October 18. So can vaccine end the COVID-19 pandemic? And the question is something that we are all debating. And what can COVID vaccine do is definitely it will prevent death. Death is the serious worry for patients infected with COVID. And vaccine is an important tool to prevent death, and also it prevents serious hospitalization. So vaccine doesn't prevent infection from happening. You might get infected, but once you're affected, the antibodies that the vaccine is generating in your body will neutralize the virus that is infecting you, and you will become all right, and you will not go through the serious infection that an unvaccinated patient may go through. So there are different kinds of vaccines that have been developed and that are the inactivated virus, live attenuated virus, protein subunit, virus-like particles, virus vector, mRNA vaccine, which is the ones that are produced by Moderna and Pfizer, and the DNA vaccine, which is the one that is produced by an Indian company called Zydus Cadila. So there are quite a lot of vaccines that are developed using various various virus candidates, and they are all very effective in terms of protecting or developing antibodies that will protect you from the virus infection. So when you look at the current uptake of vaccines for COVID-19 in Europe, and if you take Europe into consideration, nearly 68% of the population of Europe have received first dose of vaccine. And if you take the number of people who have received both doses of vaccine, that is the full vaccination, 63.6% of individuals living in Europe have been vaccinated for both doses. And it is the most recent data. So even in Europe, you would see that not the entire population has been vaccinated, but we are getting closer to that. And if you take India into consideration, India is a country which is very huge and has a large population, and more than 1 billion individuals in India have been vaccinated with the first dose. Approximately 30% of Indians have been vaccinated with the second dose too. But it's a long way to go to vaccinate the rest of the population. And India is more than 1.4 billion people. And hopefully all the entire population could be vaccinated with first dose by the end of December, if the speed at which the vaccination is going on. But we also need to make sure that we receive the second dose of vaccine in order to get the maximum efficacy of the vaccination. And for the entire population in India to be vaccinated with both doses of vaccine, I don't think this is achievable before the middle or maybe September, October of 2022. So it's a long way to go, and we have to live with the vaccine. And there are people who might not have received vaccine. And those are the people the government should target and go and ensure that they are protected too. So vaccine is an important aspect for prevention and restoration of normalcy in the world. And this is something that we hope will be achieved, because there are quite a few people in the world who do not want to take vaccines for various reasons. So when you look at the different types of vaccines, you see DNA vaccine, RNA vaccine, like I shared in that cartoon 2 slides ago. And some of the companies that have come out with these vaccines are already in the market and are being used in different parts of the world. The current limitation for all these vaccines is the number of doses that they could manufacture. And many in the African countries have not received even the first dose. And some of the countries in the African countries have only got 2% of their population covered by the vaccine. And all these vaccines cost money too. And many of the poor countries cannot afford to buy the vaccine. So other countries may have to buy and supply it to them through a network that is supported by WHO. So once we have the vaccine program rolling out, instead of pandemic, it's going to become endemic, and only certain parts of the world are going to have COVID vaccine, and certain part of the world would have been recovered from the COVID vaccine, so that the economy can come back to normal. So once there is abundance in the production of vaccine, once countries have vaccinated most of their individuals, they should share the vaccine to countries that cannot have the possibility to buy the vaccine. So the vaccines and the mechanisms are all shown in this slide. There are protein vaccines, viral vaccines, nucleic acid vaccines, and all of them are having different levels of protectiveness, ranging from 55 to 60% to all the way to 97%. And this is how the the vaccine response works. You might have an initial infection, and with one dose, you will get a primary immune response, and with the second dose, you will have a booster immune response. And it is quite important that over a period of time, maybe 6 months or 9 months later, we need to have additional booster dose in order to ensure that we maintain good memory of B cells and T cells, so that the protection against COVID can last for a much longer time. So how does the RNA vaccine work? The scientists take part in the virus genetic code that tells cells what to build and coat in a lipid so it can enter the body and cells. So this is injected into the patient. So the vaccine includes the coronavirus spike protein. So this is the encoded message that goes in, and this prompts the immune system to produce antibodies and activate T cells to destroy the infected cells. So the RNA vaccine has got a clear mechanism with which it will work. And many of the ingredients that are used in the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine are all something that is very important for us to know. Whereas in Moderna vaccine, the active ingredient is synthetic messenger RNA, whereas in Pfizer, it's a nucleoside modified messenger RNA. So these two are different viruses, different components in the virus to elicit immune response that are needed for protection. So how some of the COVID vaccines compare? These are all the major COVID vaccines that are available throughout the world. And you can see that these vaccines are all giving protection in excess of 90%. But the limitation for Moderna and Pfizer vaccine is that you need to store at deep freezer temperature. Pfizer at -70 and Moderna at -20. And this is something that is difficult to achieve in an Indian scenario. That's why these two vaccines are not opted for in India, whereas the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is produced by Serum Institute of India as a COVID shield, and our Indian own made in India vaccine is the Covaxin produced by Bharat Biotech, are all coming out with fantastic results. So how effective are the COVID-19 vaccine candidates? They are very effective. And this effectiveness is really achieved in a very big way for the Moderna, BioNTech or Sputnik vaccine. Whereas for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, what has become apparent is that if you have the dose interval between the first dose and second dose to be shorter as 4 weeks, the vaccine efficacy is probably up to 70%. Whereas if you extend the gap between the first dose and the second dose to 10 to 12 weeks, the vaccine efficacy improves beyond 90%. So can the vaccine end the COVID pandemic? This is the major question that is present in everybody. Looking through what we have just discussed, it should end the pandemic until we reach the entire population with both doses of vaccine. We may have to live with the COVID-19 infection, with the restrictions, with hand washing, social distancing, and wearing of masks becomes very important. So can the vaccines end the pandemic? Yes, of course, it can end the pandemic, provided everybody takes the vaccine. Can a single vaccine be enough? No, single vaccine does not give adequate protection, maybe up to 60% or 70% in some cases, but not 100%. Can you combine vaccine for 100% protection? That is being done. So in Sweden, we have people who have received AstraZeneca vaccine in the beginning, have now been switched over to Pfizer vaccine or Moderna vaccine. So combining two different vaccines seems to be quite efficacious, and in some cases they have shown that the efficacy improves beyond what it can protect with one vaccine alone. So combination of vaccine is helpful. Do you need the third dose? Maybe yes. More and more studies are coming out to show that a third dose of vaccine will be very, very essential. But we are not there yet for the third dose as far as India is concerned. So that is something one should start thinking of rolling out sometime in the middle of next year. So the third dose of vaccine is something everybody should have. And maybe that can happen after the middle of 2022, and that can extend to 2023. So basically, you're looking at COVID as a long haul, and this COVID is something that's going to stay with us for some more years. So it's important that we are better prepared for that. So how do we make it work? We need to make sure that people accept the vaccine and take the vaccine. So facilitating vaccination acceptance and uptake is very important. And European Center for Disease Control comes out with a 5C model, which is confidence, constraints, complacency, calculation, and collective responsibility to ensure everybody is protected. If you are not vaccinated, you become a risk for getting infected that you can spread it to other people. For instance, you might seen in the news a few days ago, the former Secretary of the State and Major General Colin Powell died. He was vaccinated with both the doses, but he was also suffering from a disease called multiple myeloma, which means if you are vaccinated and you are having some coexisting morbidities, the unvaccinated individual can spread disease to them that can be fatal in spite of both the vaccines. So your coexisting conditions also determine how much your vaccines are going to be effective. But we are also facing another thing called long COVID. Long COVID is in some percentage of individuals, maybe 25% of patients who are infected and recovered from COVID. COVID leaves a lasting impact on them with some derangement in the brain function, derangement in the heart function, and also in the respiratory function. And at SSIHL, we have developed tools by which we can measure all the three parameters and give a collective score to show who are all the people who are likely to develop long COVID. This also is the subject of our application for a research grant and collaboration with an Australian university for the Indo-Australian program, which is focused on long COVID and how to detect it. And once you detect it, what kind of precautions you can take for these long COVID patients to protect them from either problem with their psychology or problem with their heart. One of the common conditions that are seen in long COVID patients is myocarditis. So this can also be damaging. And the normal life of these long COVID patients may not be 100% good. So this is something that is undergoing intense study, and hopefully our tools that we developed at SSIHL should allow us to measure the long COVID very effectively and identify people who require more protection. So with this, I end my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention. And at SSIHL, we are doing quite a lot of COVID-related work, and much of the work is really contributing to the fighting the pandemic. And hopefully, we will find a solution to end the pandemic in the near future. With this, I thank you all, and I dedicated my talk to Bhagwan Sri Sathya Sai Baba for all that goodwill that he is bringing to the world. Sai Ram. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for giving us all a very nice understanding of the whole vaccination program and also a view into something that's been perplexing the whole world now for more than a year, close to 2 years. Thank you, sir. Moving on, the next we have a special keynote address by Dr. Gautam Menon. Gautam Menon is a professor of physics and biology at Ashoka University, Sonipat. Currently online from the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai, where he was the founding dean of the Computational Biology Group. He is the director of the Center for Climate Change and Sustainability at Ashoka University. He was awarded the Swarna Jayanti Fellowship of the DST, was an outstanding research investigator of the DAE SRC, has been named an outstanding referee of the American Physical Society, and is a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences, India. Apart from his scientific work, he is interested in making science accessible to the public. Dr. Gautam Menon will be talking to us on models for COVID-19 in India, what they can and cannot do. I now welcome Dr. Gautam Menon.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay.
Yes,
so
sir, we can.
Let me begin by sharing my screen. Okay, the usual check. Can you see my full screen now? Is my full screen visible to all of you?
You have to share the screen, sir. Not yet visible.
I am actually sharing this. Let me just try again. Okay, so that should work.
Yes, sir. Now it is visible.
Okay, I'm now in full screen mode. And yeah, so thank you for that very kind introduction. And I really enjoyed Dr. Sanjeevi's very impressive survey of COVID-19. And I'm very grateful to SSIHL for this invitation, for this Indo-US meeting. I want to talk about work that we've been doing on modeling COVID-19 in India and looking at the implications. We've really been interested in questions of policy. What makes for good policy when one deals with infectious diseases of the type that COVID-19 is? What can we talk about what can we optimize in terms of testing strategies, school reopenings? These are questions that I would like to address. There's been a lot of buzz in the media, especially over the past month or so, about a potential third wave, numbers of cases, etc. There are these sort of strange numbers that are floating around. We could have 6 lakh cases per day, etc., etc., etc. Government warnings. There's something about Navi Mumbai's case doubling. So there seems to be some amount of innumeracy in general about this. I mean, doubling rate of 1,800 days is a little less than 5 years, which seems to be, if we had thought about any disease with a doubling rate of that long, that is really not an important concern for us, would not be an important concern for everyone. But what can we say, and what are the sort of models that go into making predictions like this? Are they worth doing at all? Which is this question of what should models be doing, what should they not be doing? But you can understand why there's concern about this. This is the current state of the Indian pandemic. We had a relatively gentle, more spread out first wave, which peaked around the 13th of September of 2020. Then we saw a fairly sharply rising and in a sense, very traumatic second wave for India that peaked around somewhere between the 10th and the 15th of May. And at the peak, we were having around 410,000 recorded cases per day. But of course, the number of recorded cases is far less than the true number of cases that are behind. We know that many people were unable to be tested, were unable to access medical treatment at that time. And what we're really now seeing is a long tail to the right hand side. Currently, India is recording a little more than about 15,000 cases per day. And this has been declining at a fairly slow rate. These are the current hotspots. Much of the north of India is seeing very low test positivity, very small numbers of cases on a day-to-day basis, a small number of deaths. So the main contributors to the current case count comes from the state of Kerala, to some extent the state of Maharashtra, and some states in the northeast of India, in particular Mizoram. So if you look at the difference between 28th July and 26th October, which is yesterday, 28th July we had 43,000 new cases, 640 deaths, etc. We had a TPR of 2.4%, and we were vaccinating at the rate of about 3.94 million per day. Switch to October. We now have that the case count has now dropped to about 13,472. There's a slight discrepancy between this and the earlier number because they're calculated in slightly different ways. One looks at an average over a couple of days, one is a count on that day. We are at about 584 deaths per day. Our test positivity, which is one very important indication of the strength of the pandemic, has dropped to 1.23%. Even in Kerala, it's hovering around about 10% at the moment, and we're vaccinating more. We're vaccinating it at close to 6 lakhs, and that has flagged a little bit in the last week to 10 days, whereas before that, we were vaccinating at levels of about 10 million plus. So part of this is supply issues, diversion of some of the stock of vaccines to external commitments, etc. But hopefully we should stabilize somewhere between 10 and 20 million in the months to come. And that will be, I think, our own best way of dealing with the pandemic at the moment. This is the division of cases across Indian states. India at 15,000 odd, Mizoram at 535. Kerala, as I said, at 7,622. Maharashtra is also somewhere on this list. Himachal Pradesh, Manipur, Meghalaya, the states of the Manipur and Meghalaya, the states of the northeast. Even Tamil Nadu among the south is showing a fairly large number of cases at about 981. But on the other hand, this is a situation, if you look at the trends in the decrease in cases, this is actually a very positive situation compared to just where we were in May and June. Our most, in a sense, important information regarding what's going on with the Indian pandemic comes from the round 4 of the ICMR National Seroprevalence Survey, as well as subsequent seroprevalence surveys that have been conducted in multiple states and union territories of India. Over here, so this was conducted around May, June, a little after the peak of the second wave. And you can see from this that states such as Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, etc., which are the states in the north, the so-called Bimaru states, are showing seroprevalences of more than somewhere between 70 to 80%. And this was then, and cases were declining, but declining relatively slowly. So it's reasonable to assume that these numbers have now gone up to about 80% plus. It's in the states of the south that you still have relatively lower values of seroprevalence. In Kerala has the lowest across India at about 44%, Maharashtra at about 58, and that suggests a slight differential between the north and the south in terms of how widely the disease is spread across that. So for much of North India, so many people have already been infected in the vicinity of 80 plus. In Delhi, a recent sero survey said somewhere between 80 and 90% of people in Delhi had already been infected or had antibodies against COVID-19. This is important in terms of what we might project for the future. This is the picture of the first wave where the first peak. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work on the first wave. You can see the cases on the top and the deaths below. And you can see this is a fairly broad wave. You can see April, May, it begins to take off. By February, it still has a longish tail. And this built up slowly, very much in comparison to the second wave. A wave of disease that builds up slowly is, of course, much easier to manage than something that picks up very fast. And many of the difficulties with dealing with the second wave were because of this very sharp increase in cases, really between a period of about April and May, which meant that much of healthcare infrastructure, hospitals, its ICU beds, etc., were vastly overloaded at that time. The models that I want to talk about are models that were developed as part of an initiative for scientists and healthcare professionals, visual artists, science communicators, etc., that was under an umbrella group called the Indian Scientists Response to COVID-19. Our model is a complex model by most standards. It includes the possibility of people being infected asymptomatically, people having mild infections, people having severe infections that require hospitalization, and people having critical infection from which they may either recover or they may die. So that's the broad structure of a patient's trajectory following infection. Most patients tend to be asymptomatically infected. They recover in a fairly short time compared to either the mild or the severe infections. Severe and critical, of course, relatively small numbers of patients will require hospitalization. You will have to, certain level of severity has to be assumed there. But in terms of the total number of infections, this is a fairly small fraction. So conventional models such as the SIR model have to be generalized to accommodate the complexities that I showed you here if we want to make useful predictions or projections for what might happen to the pandemic. So that's the different states. You have a susceptible state, you have an exposed state where you spend about 3 to 4 days following infection, but before you become infectious to other people. The exposed state then branches out into asymptomatically infected and pre-symptomatically infected. There's a relatively small period that you spend there. In asymptomatic, you may spend 5 to 7 days in an asymptomatic state before you recover, and during that period, you're infected. In the pre-symptomatic state, you spend a relatively smaller time, maybe 2 to 3 days, before either being mildly symptomatic or severely symptomatic. And if you're severely symptomatic, you move at some rate to either being hospitalized, and then with small probability you die or you recover. The numbers that go into this are all benchmarked against clinical numbers that we have essentially both from India as well as across the world. And this is work that is currently under review in this following medRxiv article that you can see over there. So this is what is technically called a 9-compartmental epidemiological model. It is age structured, so each compartment is divided into multiple subcompartments representing ages 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, etc., etc. So we have measures of the levels of the amount of population in each of these things. So we know what is the fraction of the population, say between 30 and 40, that is in an exposed state or a pre-symptomatic state, etc. There's also contact structure. So in each of these, for example, if you looked at the contacts between a susceptible person and a pre-symptomatic person or a severely infected person, that is given by the information that we have about social contact networks in India. And these are sort of standard studies. It's important to incorporate this because of the possibility of multi-generational families in India. And if you have a grandparent staying in the same house as a young child, the child is not vaccinated, the grandparent may or may not be vaccinated, but a child can transfer the infection to someone elderly. And then the older you get, of course, you know that the consequences of having a COVID infection become correspondingly serious. So these are things that you can incorporate if you do have good models that have contact structure. This is studied within a Bayesian framework. It's a combination of a fit both to cases and to deaths. We account for severe and hospitalized cases. We implement interventions. You can put in lockdowns and so on. You account for case undercounting. So the fact that you will not detect all the cases that are there of true infections. You account for the undercounting of deaths to some extent. You account for improvements in case identification and testing and quarantining, etc. Thereby the slow secular reduction of the infections by infected people on the symptomatic population, as well as improvements in treatment. So all of this we put into this model, which has a fair amount of complexity here. Here is the daily case rate. So if you go back to the paper, we have a fairly detailed description of multiple Indian districts in the state of Karnataka, major Indian cities, Mumbai, Chennai, Bombay, etc., as well as an overall India picture. So that's what we get for the predictions of this model for cases and deaths. In a sense, it's not really a prediction; it's a retrodirected prediction. It's for the first wave, and we sort of finalized much of our work during the second wave. And I will tell you what we get out of this that is of relevance to the second wave and what happened after that. So you can see that there are multiple waves of disease. These reflect both in cases and in deaths. Here is our idea of what is the cumulative infected and the level of undercounting. By the time you get to February 15th, 2021, which is the onset of the second wave, we have about 60 to 65% infected in Mumbai. And then overall undercounting of states, even though it starts off very large, somewhere between 80 and 100 in the beginning when the pandemic started, towards the end of the pandemic, towards the end of the first wave, the undercounting was a factor of about 10 to 15, consistent with what is generally known about that time. Here are results for India to the right, and that's the bottom right picture that you can see is a comparison of two different types of calculations. One is our own calculation that you can see in the bands, in the gray bands that you can see. This is for the reproductive ratio. And the lines that you can see, the dotted lines that go up and down over there, embedded in that graph, is computed from a completely different statistical method by other people. So you can see that broadly speaking, we recover the sort of trends and behavior even within our model, which is somewhat technically very different from models that go into computing statistically the reproductive ratio. The bottom line here is that we estimate about 35% were infected in the first wave. The IFR is about 0.1%. The case undercounting was about 20 at the end, much larger initially. And the factor of death undercounting in the first wave is a fairly broad, it's somewhere between 2 and 5. And we chose 2.2, 2.3 as being optimal for our fits. This agrees with various other estimates made by other people. What about the second wave? There are major problems with data in the second wave, and mainly because there's a very large divergence between the actual cases and the recorded cases. There's also a very large divergence between actual and recorded deaths, and that also degrades the ability of models such as ours to be able to predict what might happen. And also, there have been many deaths for other reasons. For example, inability to access medical care, the lack of oxygen, the lack of ICU during the second wave. And so, whether one should count these in this particular calculation or not becomes an interesting question. How does one rationalize numbers of deaths where those deaths could have been for other reasons? Even though we decided to sort of not investigate this because of real problems with data, it was somewhat hard to stay away. We did make some early projections for Maharashtra. We said that Maharashtra would come down by about somewhere between the 15th and 30th of April. It turned out that's exactly what happened, even though at the point we were sort of seeing the peak at this particular point here. But very soon after that, it began to turn down, consistent with what we were projecting. And this was advice that we gave to the government at that point. For India, we sort of saw it going up, but then we suggested that around the 15th of May, between the 10th to peak in mid-May, with a rough number of about 500,000 to 600,000 cases per day, was what we suggested to government at that point. And the recorded number was around 410,000, 412,000. But that number, of course, depends upon the quality of your recording, the levels of your testing, etc. So it's almost certain that that number, instead of being 410,000, was probably something like maybe 1.5 times that or 1.2 times that, even taking into account the difficulties in determining the actual number of cases from recorded infections. We have been doing more recently work on the districts of Andhra Pradesh, looking at the state as a whole as well as different districts, and you can see where our models are going. We're sort of predicting a downtrend basically across much of Andhra in terms of actual behavior, and this is our fits to both the first wave and the second wave. So that's what we've been doing with epidemiological models. Let me move now to what I think models are really useful for, which is to try and understand policy and to determine what is optimal policy. So one question that we have been looking at is what are optimal testing strategies for COVID-19? In this, we have been looking at what are called network models of testing. And the question here is that India has two types of tests. One is a medium accuracy test. The advantage here is that it is inexpensive. It's a point of care test, and this is called a rapid antigen test or an RAT. It also has a high accuracy test, which turns out to be costly. It's not point of care. The delays are typically somewhere between 12 and 24 hours, even more in cases of high caseload. And this is an RT-PCR test. So given that you have a mix of a cheaper point of care test that is less sensitive, the RAT test, as well as the more expensive, potentially delayed testing method, which is the RT-PCR, how do you determine what are optimal quantums of testing? How do you determine the mix of tests? How does this depend upon the sensitivity of the test? And how do you decide who to test? These are questions that people are looking at. These models are what are called network models. So we have network models that describe people at homes, workplaces, hospitals, etc. So people move between the homes and their work locations. Some of these work locations may be hospitals as well. If a person tests positive, they're confined within their home until they recover. They're isolated. And even others in the same home can either be allowed to go to other locations or not, assuming that there is some level of masking and isolation of the person who's infected within the home. Disease can spread in workplaces where people go. And workplaces, of course, is a place where many people actually mix. The pictures that you see to the bottom right are pictures of how the disease spreads across the network. These networks contain somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 individuals. They reproduce statistics of the family sizes, the distribution of ages, etc., as well as many other sorts of branching properties that are known for the disease. There is a home to work ratio at about 10 to 1. There are a few hospitals. There's between 2750 and 27,500 different locations altogether. Number of individuals per home is a Poisson distribution with a mean equal to 4. We start at different stages of the epidemic. We put in multiple stages, like the complexity that I showed you earlier, asymptomatic infections, severe infections, etc. We work with a whole bunch of different networks to make sure that our results are not biased by a special choice of network. And we can also look at the varying costs of tests. What is the relative cost of an RT-PCR test versus a rapid antigen test to compute the economic impacts? This is sort of examples of typically what we do. You can vary the fraction of RATs on one axis, the sensitivity of the rapid antigen test on the other axis, and the total final fraction infected at the end of the pandemic, which is our benchmark for how effective any strategy has been. You just compute how many people were infected at the end. And you can see that at different daily testing rates, so that's the top left figure, daily testing rates of 0.1%, 0.2%, 0.3%, etc., you can see the number of those infected coming down as you increase the daily testing rate. And you can also look at every point here is a certain fraction of the rapid antigen test, either going from no antigen tests at all to 100% antigen tests, the remaining being taken up by the PCR, as well as the sensitivity, which varies between about 0.5 and 0.1 for RAT. So the numbers here matter. The RAT sensitivities have been argued to be anywhere between about 55% and 70%. There are improved tests, so there are better tests on the market where you can get sensitivities between 70 and 90% even for the RATs. You can vary quarantine procedures. When you quarantine, when you declare the result, quarantine when you sample the results, etc., and see what happens. You can look at the economic costs of this. So as a function of daily testing rates, what happens? What happens with the effect of NPIs? If you add masking, modeled in various ways, how do the final total number of infected finally change, depending upon where you start off in the pandemic? Here's a summary. The quantum of testing is probably the most important thing to control. Right now, or at that time when this paper was written, we were at less than 0.1% of the population, but a number that's about 5 times that, 3 to 5 times that would be much better. And how much you test is also important. Where you are relative to the epidemic is also important. Delays in the return of RT-PCR test results is very bad. That can completely vitiate any advantage that you have from more sensitive tests. The mixture of tests, how much RAT, how much PCR, is relatively unimportant provided you're testing more. And sensitivity of these tests is also relatively less important, except if you go below 50%. So pretty much the ballpark numbers for sensitivity for the RAT test that you have now, that the mix of tests, none of this matters very much. What matters is the amount at which you test. And there is a significant and very nonlinear combination of the importance of non-pharmaceutical interventions where you can get a better control over the results that you have. And so this is work that was published a few months ago in PLOS Computational Biology, and this was also highlighted in various venues in the press. It was taken up for mainly because we pointed out that governments, this is something that extends even beyond India, that governments in low and middle income countries might be able to achieve optimal outcomes by concentrating on ramping up testing using less sensitive tests which provide immediate results rather than favoring the RT-PCR. The second thing that we looked at is what is the best vaccination protocol. And over here now you can see that these are much more complex models. The model to the top that you can see is the incisive model that I told you about, the 9-compartmental age-structured model. But now you can ask what happens to that if you have 1 shot of vaccine, 2 shots of vaccine, and relatively different levels of protection between this. The questions here really have to do with the competition between demography and risk. Should you pursue an age downward vaccination strategy or age upward vaccination strategy? Should you target certain groups within the population for this? How does the distribution of ages within the population as well as their relative risk matter? And how does it, where you start off the epidemic, how does that matter? We only started vaccinations in January, on January 16th of this year with healthcare workers, and then that was ramped up on March 1st and then April 1st, extended to various larger segments of the population. So questions, should you prioritize elderly or the young? Should you prioritize the first or the second dose? What happens to mortality in each strategy? And you can look at these numbers and how much they change. The results here is that prioritizing older populations who are most at risk results in the most significant mortality reduction. So if your preferred endpoint is a reduction in overall mortality, it's always good to pursue an age downward strategy in vaccinations. The amounts of vaccinations are crucial. You must vaccinate more, and so that we made various suggestions. And of course, I have been saying this for a while, that even when our vaccination levels were between 2 and 3 million per day, that we needed to push this up at least to about 10 million. And we have touched that, the 10 million plus, on multiple days in the last couple of months, but we do need to do more on that. We suggested again from these results that you should prioritize first doses. It's also important for reinfection. And a little more was that the timing of the second dose was not particularly crucial. And this is a sort of delicate point that really it boils down to the fact that protection against serious infection and death is ensured by your first dose. So even a first dose of vaccine does a reasonably good job of protecting against death and infection, and death and severe COVID-19, although it may not protect so well against mild and symptomatic infection. Question of reopening schools has been on everyone's mind. This is from a few months ago, where this is probably as of July, which mapped down. By then, some schools had begun to reopen in sort of small pockets of India. Already, school, although still, I think much of India is yet to open up at any significant level, especially open up completely. And this has now been a year and a half or so that children have been out of schools, and there are long-term consequences of this. We've been looking at this with similar agent-based and network models where you have schools, you have embedded in communities. So the idea is here, you have models for schools where you have children going to school and coming back to homes. These are embedded in a community with homes that surround that. You have people from home, elders at home or adults at home going to work and then coming back. All of this put together in a complicated network model. You have initially vaccinated populations, and then you can try and ask, what happens when I send children back to school? So you can start with a situation where children are not in school. Then you send them to school with a certain background level of seroprevalence within the population, with an ongoing vaccination program within the population. And then you can ask what happens to the nature of disease. You can ask about the difference between no vaccinations versus vaccinations and the levels of seroprevalence at different times and how cases. So the picture to the top right is the number of infections in children. The picture to the bottom right is, and so these are different levels of 30% and 50% have initially recovered. So the more people who've had a prior infection, the smaller the impact of that on, for example, the low risk population. But you do see a rise in cases in that low risk population. This is with no vaccination programs. You can add on this a vaccination program and look at initial seroprevalence of 30% or 50%. And you can see that the 0 to 18-year-olds still show a peak because they are not vaccinated, although the adults surrounding them are vaccinated. This is an overall reduction in the potential force of infection. And over on the top left, you can see how the numbers of the fraction of population increases as you go ahead in time. And if you can ask similar questions for adults for the 18-year plus at different levels, and by the time you get to a 0.2% vaccination rate and you ask for the impact of cases on 18-year-olds plus, given that you're now sending children back to school, you find that that impact is actually fairly small. That really is what the sort of question that you want to look at. So here are the results of this. This is that you can open schools once enough people are vaccinated. You need to be in particular on the downswing of the infection, which is true in India currently. Masking, etc., will help reduce the cushioning will help to cushion the impact of sending children back to school. You can do this fairly safely once you're at overall seropositivity levels of greater than 75%. This is a statement that we made very explicitly to some governments who had asked for this information. By the time you get to 75 to 80%, you're relatively safe in sending children back to school. The main worry here is that children will take the infection back home to family members who are elderly and thereby infect them. And the consequences of infecting someone older is potentially much more serious than the consequence of infecting a young child. Typically, they will tend to be asymptomatic. There is a small possibility of MIS-C and other types of complications, but that can be sorted out by just looking very carefully at symptomatic children and not really worrying about the nature of infection in other children, because pretty much for children under the age of 18, there is not much of a difference between between infections caused by influenza versus COVID-19. Modulo the possibility, which we still don't know enough about some long COVID symptoms, as well as the rare possibility of MIS-C and similar consequences of that. Again, if and when we open up vaccinations to the under 18, we have to reapproach some of these questions and ask, does that make a difference? So one suggestion that we made explicitly was that it was important to prioritize family members of school-going children, and that would be an important way of ensuring that it does not escape into the larger community, which may still contain people who have not been vaccinated yet. We recommended that teachers and school staff be vaccinated on priority, in addition to prioritizing the family of school-going children. And this is sort of work done for various organizations here. This is contained in an op-ed article that we wrote a few months ago, around the time that some schools at September 1st were thinking of opening up. It says that we predicted that a rise in cases in children could occur, but that you could proceed with in-person schooling with some level of caution. So I can recommend that you read this and read our analysis and a description of what the model is, because it's described well in here. The last thing that I want to talk about, the second last thing that I want to talk about, I want to give an overall summary at the end, is what happens, where is the future of disease modeling? It's my feeling, it's my conviction that the future of disease modeling lies in a type of model called the agent-based model. Agent-based models are models in which you model at the level of an individual on a computer. You model the interactions of individuals, the movements of the individuals, transmission mechanics of the dynamics of transmission between people, the economic decisions that people make. And in this, we have been developing a model at Ashoka University with collaborators called BharatSim. BharatSim is what you might call an ultra large scale. By ultra large scale, I mean something potentially capable of simulating around 100 million plus of agents with properties that are derived from a synthetic population that is specific to India. There are various other words used. For digital twin is another word that is used sometimes. We prefer the word synthetic population. So that's a population that mirrors the actual properties, the statistical properties of the real population in as accurate a way as possible, in a way that it can be used by large-scale computer simulations. So BharatSim is broken up into a bunch of different parts. One is a computational framework to simulate agents conveniently in large numbers. And in this, how agents interact with each other, their spatial locations, families, etc., must all come into play here. The larger part of this, and in a sense, the more interesting part, is how do you construct a good synthetic population for agents? So that's where the computer science, machine learning aspects of this problem come in, as well as the ability to talk to social scientists, gather all the data that is available, and to put it into some form that is usable. So this is work done by Ashoka University, by myself at Ashoka University with collaborators, and a company called ThoughtWorks, and it's funded by the Gates Foundation. Let me give you an example of what I would consider to be a good synthetic population. So here might be some person who's a member of the synthetic population that I'm considering, and this person looks like a perfectly reasonable person that you might meet on the road or something like that. But this picture is drawn from a website which says thispersondoesnotexist.com. So it's actually made, this picture that you can see is made using a composite of machine learning techniques of adversarial neural networks that are applied to a large number of pictures, and you create a composite from them that doesn't resemble any individual really, but nevertheless has this property of being surprisingly realistic. You can recognize instantly that this is a very specific person, and this is someone you might potentially run into if you walk down the road. So the idea would be to create a synthetic population that is indistinguishable from the results of what you get if you went out and did a survey in a particular area. You construct the synthetic population using data from multiple surveys and combining machine learning methods. So a computer scientist at Ashoka University is a collaborator in this. We draw from gender, age distributions, family sizes, socioeconomic data, pre-existing conditions, etc., from a variety of surveys that we have, the NFHS, the Health Heat Map of Data, IHDS, as well as hopefully in the future, people who send us data directly from surveys that I have run, which are completely anonymized. So we have no information about them. But we can nevertheless put that into the synthetic population that we're actually constructing. Here's a visualization of the synthetic population for Pune city. This is a total 3 million that is now spread out among these different zones and wards inside Pune. And over here, you can look at how disease might spread between day 21 and day 42. The red color here is an indication of the number of those infected. And we can actually ask questions about the spatial spread of disease in this particular example. You can introduce in these computational models multiple strains. So you can model a first initial slower wave with one strain, and then the introduction of a new variant of the virus at day 100, and which is much more transmissible. And then you can see a nice sharp second peak as a consequence. So these are questions that we can ask in the future, given that a certain number of people have already been infected by this, a certain number of people have been vaccinated. There is some level of immunity that might wear off very slowly. What happens if there is something which is much more transmissible, say, than the Delta variant, which comes along? What would you predict for the future? What lies in the future for India? Will there be a third wave? Again, going back to the question that we asked earlier, and again, this was sort of discussed. This is going to be a topic of great discussion and in the future. It depends upon what you call a wave, and we that again, there is no accepted a priori definition of a wave of disease. You can sort of look at it as some rise and hump in the cases, but how do you distinguish a gentle hump from a hump that is much larger in the context of a large country like this? India is certainly a question of definitions. It depends upon the number of active infections currently and how they grow. So it's a priority to reduce that number of active infections. So this is something that the Kerala government should specifically be looking at, as well as governments in the northeast. The numbers of susceptible also is very important. Most of India has sustained some level of prior infection. And the numbers, if you look at the ICMR Sero survey, that suggests a number of about 65, 66%. And that certainly will damp down the possibility of a severe new wave in which many people will have to go to hospital. The levels of restrictions of non-pharmaceutical interventions, social mixing, mask wearing restrictions, etc., will also determine the rate at which any new variant might actually spread, or any old variant might actually spread in an increasing manner as you remove these things. We know relatively less. We know that reinfections are there. We know relatively less about the importance of reinfections for people already infected once with the Delta variant in, let us say, the months of April and May, where much of India actually got infected, people who were vaccinated after that. So the combination of an infection and a vaccination after that is genuinely very protective. What is the importance of vaccine breakthroughs? This is something that the data is only slowly coming in. There's lots of conflicting international data. There certainly is a possibility of vaccine breakthroughs, but typically these will lead to mildly symptomatic disease, and is relatively rare that it will lead to severe disease. And usually this is connected with old age or with a variety of other types of coexisting morbidities. What about new variants? This is something that's impossible to predict, and it looks as though much of the toolkit of the virus is now being exhausted. We are seeing the same variants come up over again, but there could still is room for surprises. For example, there is a subvariant of the Delta variant, which could potentially seems to be spreading in the UK at a somewhat faster rate, but it's not clear that the advantage over Delta is that significant. Whether it's a wave or not depends upon whether you count an infection as a wave or symptomatic illness as a wave. You tend to pick up in hospital symptomatic illness, but there could be a large background of people who are infected but show no symptoms at all. And from most points of view, that would be fine. Of course, evolutionary pressures to create new variants. You have a vaccination program. There will be evolutionary pressures to create new variants. People who are immunocompromised can have the virus survive in them for long periods of time. So possibly for that particular subcategory of people, an additional booster dose may be particularly important. The question of sterilizing immunity is fairly clear that there is no real sterilizing immunity against COVID-19, but it does seem as though people infected for a second time or vaccinated or infected earlier tend to be infected for a shorter period when they're infected again. This is, the divergence between variants presumably does not affect cellular immune response from T and B cells very much. All the neutralizing antibody titers will actually go down, and boosters may push that up. And if you look at variant divergence, alpha, gamma, delta, beta is a level of at which you're sort of doing variations here. And usually, no, that the vaccine response is protective against severe illness. Certainly protective against symptomatic infection most of the time. Protection against infection might tend to wear off as you go off in time, as you go increase in time. Delta now pretty much is the only game in town, is a dominant variant across much of India and the world. In if you sort of look at all of the data together, it certainly looks as though in well vaccinated countries, the surge in cases that Delta has caused is no longer mirrored in the deaths. And this is the UK and Portugal, where at that time, this is from some months ago, where about 50% to 43% of people were fully vaccinated. You can compare that to countries with relatively low levels of vaccination, Namibia, Tunisia, South Africa, Russia, etc. And you can see that as cases have risen, deaths have also gone up here. Whereas if you look at the UK and Portugal, the death line is very, very, very close to that axis. There's no significant numbers of deaths, even though cases have risen very substantially at that particular point. So this is all a positive. Um, Vaccines have made COVID-19 far less lethal. And here's one illustration of what happens to risk of COVID death before vaccines and where it's moved downward. And this is a log scale on the y-axis. So you can see that you have reduced your risk of death by at least an order of magnitude. And for really elderly, that has shifted equivalent to shifting it downward, so that a fully vaccinated 80-year-old has the same mortality risk as an unvaccinated 50-year-old. But on a log scale, that's a fairly significant factor of about 10. And certainly for younger people in age group even 35, 40, 30, etc., you have pushed it down into the territory which is comparable to that of a flu vaccine, of a flu, of dying of the flu, or even better. The main issues for the world at the moment are this distinction between high income, low income countries and levels of vaccination. And you can see there's a very stark difference. High income countries have been vaccinating at relatively high levels, and at the level pretty much of 100 doses per 100 people, etc. But by the time you get to upper middle, low, you can see the shift, the gradual shift downwards. And some months ago, I think in September, about a month ago, the UN chief graded the world on vaccine rollout. He said this is an F in ethics, because the rich countries in the world have stockpiled and are using vaccines at the expense of giving them to lower income countries which have relatively low levels of vaccination, in fact 5% or less across some parts of Africa. This larger question that I've been interested in is also this question of public engagement by scientists. It's not enough for scientists to just do the science, but in a pandemic situation, it's also important to be able to communicate the science to common people, to be able to tell them what is it that one ought to do, what is the level of personal intervention, what are good analogies to think about. So this is work done with a group of faculty members at the Institute of Science, at the IIT Bombay, etc., where we discuss what we know about ventilation. And this, I think, is something that has really been understressed in public communications around COVID-19 in India. The fact that ventilation is an extremely important non-pharmaceutical intervention is probably even, it's as important or even more important than just the wearing of masks. And so over here, how does one determine, for example, the nature of airflow inside a room? So we suggest a little test using an agarbatti to figure out what is the risk in a closed space. The fact that one has to be worried about regions that are air conditioned, poorly ventilated, often crowded spaces. These are regions where you can create hotspots for viral transmission. Often something that can, a simple solution that that again I sort of tell all of you, although I'm sure you already know this, is opening windows, allowing for cross ventilation, separating seats a little bit. When you are teaching classes, allow the classes to meet outside if it's at all possible in that particular season, as an alternative to being inside. So in general, better ventilation, more airflow, positioning people in zones that don't involve the recirculation of air that is being breathed out by someone. All of this is very important in preventing COVID-19 transmission. So I'm sort of finishing fairly well in advance, and I wanted to tell you about general thinking about models. I want to say that models provide a way of exploring possibilities. This is how I think about models. They provide a way of exploring a universe of possibilities that could happen. They provide you a way of looking at counterfactuals. What happens if I do not vaccinate? What happens if I do not test? What happens if I vaccinate this fraction of the population as opposed to that fraction of the population? So these may not have been how history actually unfolded in that particular context. Nevertheless, it gives you a way of testing different alternatives in terms of policy. The point I want to make about models is that you can trust good models in the short term, very specifically. If a model is functioning well and is known to be functioning well in over a period of about a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, etc., you can trust it on average in the short term. Most models are fairly similar in the nature of the information that they take in. What's important for India at the moment is what is called an ensemble prediction. Now, usually no country ever relies on the predictions of a single model. Single models are determined very much by what information the modelers choose to put into that particular model. It's acknowledged worldwide that the best way to do it is to have multiple different groups providing models, but providing the results of those models a week to 10 days in advance so that you can say that, look, in the next 10 days to 2 weeks, this is what model A predicts, model B predicts, model C predicts, model D predicts. And then you construct an ensemble of these models and combine these predictions into one overall prediction with a certain error bar around that. These ensemble predictions tend to work much better than individual projections because they sort of average out over the peculiarities and the idiosyncrasies of particular models in order to give you better answers. Right now, there is a group working on an ensemble prediction. This is a group at the Indian Institute of Science with Rajesh Indresan and Sivatreya at the ISI, who are trying to put in multiple models together and so that we can have a weekly prediction for what might happen to COVID-19 in India. And that our model as well is going to be part of that ensemble. Beyond this, we need better epidemiology, better surveys, sentinel surveillance, crowdsource efforts, data analysis. All of this has to come together. But the most important part of this is input data quality. And this is where India has done somewhat badly. The most trusted source of Indian data on Indian cases at a level of the districts and states is a completely voluntary effort called COVID-19india.org. This is not a government effort. Ideally, a government should have been stepping up. The Indian Council of Medical Research should have stepped up to put pressure on the states to provide as detailed and granular information as possible regarding day-to-day numbers and the changes of these numbers in these states. This has often been done at a very, very broad number, just a single number for a single state. That's not what is required. The better your model, the more granular they have to be, the more local they have to be. And looking at data quality, looking at data, the way data is collected is also very important. And this is something that increasingly is being realized, especially with all of this discussion around the counting of deaths in India, which has been very significantly undercounted. This is where understanding the importance of being true to data, of being honest to data and collecting it honestly because as an instrument of public purpose is very important. In general, the advice that I can give you is that you should never believe COVID-19 models, which make predictions for what will happen 2 to 3 months later. About 2 or 3 months ago, by August, July, people were predicting a peak in September, a peak in October, a bad third wave, 6 lakh cases per day, etc. None of this made sense. It doesn't make sense now. It didn't make sense at that time because it's impossible to predict what people's behavior, it's impossible to predict the nature of new variants. The best that you can do is to say, because the system has a certain inertia at the rate at which it changes, you cannot have things that happen very suddenly and very discontinuously. So what will happen in 10 days from now or a week from now is in a sense a continuation of what will happen here. The question is, can you pick up the trends where things may slightly begin to increase, slightly begin to decrease at an early enough point for you to be able to do something with it. Second point, never believe a model which claims excessive precision because that is not there in these models. We don't have that information. In fact, no model will ever be able to do that. It can give you a bunch of potential alternatives. It should give you nice error bars about the prediction that is providing. If it says that, look, we are estimating 1, 5, 3, 4, 9, 2 cases to happen tomorrow or day after, etc., that doesn't make sense because no one knows these numbers to that level of accuracy. Let me finish up with this sort of sweet picture. This is a little baby that's a mother looking very proudly at it. The baby is called Lockdown. Lockdown is a baby born in Jharkhand who was born at home at a time when all routine health services were hit. And she was called Lockdown just to make sure that no one forgot the very difficult times that India went through. And we have schools are now just opening, but we have been through a punishing set of lockdown that really affected many of the poorest in the country. We have destroyed livelihoods. It's not clear to me what public policy decisions should have been taken that might have ameliorated that. To what extent did the measures that we took early on, did they have an effect in what happened later? Could we have done things differently? These are questions, of course, to be answered at some depth later. So I've told you about epidemiological compartmental models, vaccination models using the broad description of incisive. I told you about network models for vaccination, for testing and school reopening. I told you about agent-based models the model that we work on is called Bharatsam, and Bharatsam will be made publicly available. It will take another a few weeks to a month or so. You can come to the website. There will be a Bharatsam website on in Ashoka University, where you can download the Bharatsam code and run it on your computer, and look at the question that you are interested in, and we can help you tweak that. Or if you'd like to collaborate with us on a project that is of interest to you, we'd be happy to do that. Ashoka University, where I'm at, is also interested right now in looking at health metrics across India. Again, a sort of public effort to make health data available to groups interested in studying these across the country. So setting up the infrastructure to do that. And last thing I did was to speak a little bit about the future and what I envisaged as happening in the future. So as always, this work is done, the work that I described to you is done with a large number of people. The Incisum model that we studied was done with groups at Pune, Chennai, Bangalore, etc. The work, much of what I spoke about, the network model work, the testing, etc., was done with a group of people: Sandeep Krishna at the NCBS in Bangalore, Philip Cherian at Ashoka University, Brian Wall at Johns Hopkins, Delhi, Vaibhav Sinha at the NCBS, and Farina Muzaffar at the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, who was my student. Much of this, along with the synthetic population, was done with Debayan Gupta and his group of computer scientists at Ashoka University. The group is gradually becoming larger and more diverse. Almost all of what I said, the computational parts of what I said, was done in collaboration with the group at ThoughtWorks: Harshal Hayat Nagarkar, Praveen, Chaya, Jayanta, and many others at ThoughtWorks. So this work is funded by the Gates Foundation, by WHO, by the Institute of Mathematical Sciences, by Emphasis, Ashoka University, and of course there are many people I need to thank for discussions about this. I have learned everything that I have learned about epidemiology pretty much has been from other people, and so I hope I will continue to do that. Let me thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, sir. We have one question that has come up for you, so I will just put forward that question. The question is that is it that everybody who is affected with COVID is having chronic ailments after they recover?
No, that's not true. Most people will, it seems as though most people will recover without a problem. There's a small fraction of cases which seem to be connected to what is called long COVID. And it seems as so it is very person dependent. There are people who may have breathing problems for about a few weeks after they recover from COVID. There are people who may have term problems that run, typically fatigue of some sort, that last for several months. But this is still a very small number. Most people with a COVID-19 infection may not feel it at all. They will be asymptomatic. And that we're talking about 30 to 60% of the population, and especially it depends upon how old you are. If you're younger, typically your COVID infection will be very mild. You may not notice it at all. The older you get, the more chances there are of your being symptomatic for the infection, the more chances there are of potentially worse consequences. But it's certainly not true that most people with a COVID-19 infection will have long-term consequences.
Thank you, sir. And also thank you for a very interesting and intellectual talk.
So if there is a few minutes, I would like to also ask a question. Do we have time?
Yes, sir, we have time.
Okay. Greeting, Professor Menon. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. How are you, Anuj?
Doing very well, thank you. A very fascinating talk. The way variety of work that you have talked about and the challenges in Indian settings that you kind of describe. It's not only Indian setting. We are seeing it also in the US setting. Very similar situations. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been such a huge, massive, like toll on death toll, for example, in COVID case. I just have a few questions on your talk, and particularly you talked about, let's say, the underreporting of cases or undercounting of cases. How do you, from a model perspective, so we do give the numbers, we have kind of estimated it very thoroughly using rigorous statistical inference methods, but how do you validate these numbers? How do you come out, say that, okay, this is the number, for example, in death mortality case, you can count excess death, or you can count graves, and you can compare that validations to say, yes, these are the right numbers. How can you say about the cases? What is the way to do it?
It's a combination of multiple methods. So we fit both to deaths as well as to cases. For deaths, we say that given what we know about the IFRs, given what we know about recorded deaths, given what we can guess, we do this we assume that there are some parts of particularly urban pockets in major cities in India where one assumes that death at undercounting cannot have been completely out of hand. We use that to benchmark death undercounting in other districts. We come up with some rough number for the first wave of somewhere between 2 and 5. And we finally chose, we looked at the distinction between rural and urban areas and said 2.3, 2.4 is our guess for that undercounting. So once you figure out what is the level of deaths, the difference between the actual deaths and the reported deaths there, you can say what does it imply for the counting given what you know about IFRs. How does that give you the total number of cases that must have existed, and what is the undercounting of the actual detected cases versus that? So it's a combination of multiple pieces of information. The validation of this comes from sero surveys. So you say that if given these, all of this has to be consistent with the sero survey that was done in April of last year, July of last year, December of this year, and February, and so on. So that's where these numbers come from. The way with the final all India number at the end of the first wave of 35% with the bar comes from exactly that, from these multiple lines that have to converge together to make sense. But the sero survey is the sort of canonical thing to compare with, because that's the only thing that tells you about what is the level of infection in the population.
Sure, and it may tell you the past, maybe not the current, not necessarily the current infection. So it will be good to know like what will be the trend. Another thing that very quickly, because I think the time is very limited, so that you talked about testing. One of the, when you compare the point of care testing with the PCR testing, I would guess, and this is just a guess, and please add what you think is appropriate here, that the reason PCR is kind of not really being effective is because it's overwhelmed by people, and the duration of time that it comes back, the results is taking much longer, like 2 to 5 days, let's say, some most. And if that time we can, there should be a cutoff that PCR, if you reduce that time somehow, then point of care may not be as good as, because of the sensitivity and specificity of the point of care rapid testing may be very low. So can you draw us like those threshold behavior? Is that where
So
we
we
have
can
a
do
study?
that, and that's essentially what the calculation does. But the other important thing is economics, because there is a difference in cost between the rapid antigen tests. At about, typically states have now negotiated that down to 300 to 400 rupees, whereas the PCR is 800 to 900 to 1400, depending upon which state that you want to talk about. And there are concerns that the PCR test has been negotiated down so aggressively that there may have been compromises in the quality of chemicals that go into that, and there's not enough quality control is certainly one worry. But that is significant for states who have, if you're spending, where do you get maximum value bang for your buck? If your RAT tests are that much cheaper, should you be spending this equivalent amount of money to have run a smaller amount of PCR tests, or should you use it just to ramp up your RT-PCR, your RAT tests? So it's combination of economics, combination of sensitivity, combination of testing levels, and we try to find out the optimum mix between all of this. That
I
was
see.
really. Yes.
That's explained very well. Thank you, Dr. Menon. It's amazing. I really follow you very well. I mean, in a lot of social media platform, and I encourage all the participants also to look for these experts, including Dr. Menon. He's amazing. The interviews that you have given, and many other things. So I'll stop
Thank
here.
you, Anuj.
Actually,
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for this very kind invitation.
sure.
Very
It's our
grateful.
Thank you, Dr. Anuj and Dr. Menon. I'm sure all of us would like you both to continue with your question answers because they are very relevant to each one of us today. But then we have to move on. So thank you, Dr. Menon, once again. The next, we have a plenary address by Dr. Sudha Seshayan, an outstanding academician with rich administrative experience. Dr. Sudha Seshayan, Vice Chancellor of the Tamil Nadu Dr. MGR Medical University, Chennai. She has been a medical doctor, a medical teacher, and a medical administrator for over 30 years at various levels. Having been exposed to medical administration quite early in her career, she has been able to successfully scale its heights within relative ease and grit. Sudha has been teaching both at the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. This has given her the advantage of moving with successive generations and has contributed greatly to the understanding of the milieu. She has been a regular contributor to popular magazines as well as the journals of the academia. With decades of experience in teaching and scientific writing, she has served in the international advisory and editorial boards of Gray's Anatomy and has also edited a textbook of anatomy in 3 volumes. With this introduction, I now request Dr. Sudha Seshan to address everyone. Madam, we request you to unmute your mic. Madam, you're still muted.
Yeah, is it fine now? Am I
Yes,
audible?
madam, we can hear you.
And is the screen?
Yes, madam.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, madam.
Thank you. Good morning.
Madam, can
Thank
you
you very
just
much.
make it, sorry to interrupt you, madam, can you just make it full screen,
Yeah,
madam?
I shall do that. I shall do that. Good morning. Thank you very much. And pranams to the lotus feet of Bhagwan. As we understand and as we heard the keynote speakers of the day, COVID-19 has dramatically increased the volume of our common vocabulary. Terms like R naught, model, projection studies, forecast modeling, pandemic forecasting, masking behavior, and such similar terms have got added to the common man's vocabulary. Since this is a 3-day webinar on the science of mathematical modeling, I would take this opportunity to revisit the basics of mathematical epidemiology and trace as to how more and more of inclusion has happened in this discipline. I believe this revisitation is essential for future planning and decision making with regard to healthcare demands. I would keep a general framework that can include all the various types of models, like the current multiple agent model mentioned by Dr. Anuj and the multi subpopulation and network model that Dr. Gautam Menon was mentioning about. However, at the outset, I would also like to remind most of you that the success of any predictive model will be its failure ultimately. I would qualify this statement at the end of my session. Projection, as the term can be described, is stretching forth or extending forward. This description of the term is probably a part of the human psychology because the human mind had always wanted to think beyond and visualize what would happen in future. It is a part of human curiosity, and this human curiosity is a natural advantage in terms of safety precautions. Efforts had always been consolidated to utilize the techniques of projection and forecasting for the protection of mankind from disasters and devastations. If we flip through the pages of history, we can remember one of the most devastating epidemics of the 20th century was the 1918 influenza pandemic. Various kinds of control measures were applied to bring down the devastation. Almost all kinds of gatherings, including some essential ones, were prohibited. These control measures had been implemented with whatever knowledge of transmission dynamics was available at that point of time. With advancements in the areas of mathematical epidemiology, real-time and conceptual epidemic forecasting, mathematical modeling, compartmental modeling, and computational forecasting, it has been easier to study and understand the transmission dynamics of COVID-19. 100 years between the Spanish flu and the COVID-19, the advancements of mathematical epidemiology had made the difference. In turn, it has been possible to unite appropriate decision-making interventions to mitigate the impact of the pandemic. Before treading into the zone of modern systems of forecasting, let me spend a few minutes on the history and evolution of forecasting, modeling, and projection. Forecasting makes us understand the transmission dynamics, leads to appropriate decision making, and of course, enhances administrative and governance planning. Let me get into the trodden path. John Grant, who is often called the father of demography, was also the first to systematize the science of epidemiology. His work, though considered rudimentary by current measures, analyzed the morbidity and mortality possibilities of certain diseases and can be conveniently dubbed the first effort towards disease forecasting. And this is what we find on the observations made by John Grant. In 1766, Daniel Bernoulli, the famous Swiss mathematician and physicist, used data and mathematical analysis to demonstrate the efficacy of inoculation in the control of smallpox. Then came Sir Ronald Ross, and he used a chemical theory called the law of mass action. I'm sure most of you are aware of this theory. It subscribes that the rate of chemical reaction is proportional to the concentrations of its reactants. With a lifelong interest in the malaria epidemic, Ross was one of the earliest to use mathematical models to study the epidemiology of the disease. He combined the mathematical concepts and the principles of chemistry during his study of malaria in the Mauritius. Ross worked in association with mathematician Hilda Hudson and elaborated further. The turn in mathematical epidemiology came somewhere in the 1920s, and that was when the breakthrough in mathematical forecasting was witnessed. William Ogilvy Kermack, a Scottish biochemist, and Anderson Gray McKendrick, a Scottish physician cum epidemiologist, worked in detail, keeping the Ross-Hudson study as their base. In their paper published in 1927 as a report from the laboratory of the Royal College of Physicians, Edinburgh, Kermack and McKendrick discussed the factors that led to the termination of an epidemic before compartmentalizing the population into the susceptible, infected, and the removed groups. This is where the popular SIR model of epidemiology evolved from. The two emphasized that for each particular set of infectivity, recovery, and death rates, there would be a critical density of population. We do find the three compartments, and subsequent models have developed the last compartment into subgroups. And as the KMK model recognized the compartments, the model also recognized the value of critical density. If the actual population density be equal to the critical density, introduction of an infected person to the population would not cause an epidemic. But if the threshold density is exceeded, an epidemic would explode. The epidemic would continue as long as the density of the unaffected population is greater than the critical density. In 1932 and 1933, Kermack and McKendrick added certain assumptions and arbitrary functions to their investigation and published more details. The initial epidemic model of Kermack-McKendrick theory was a kind of a differential equation model in which the age of infection influenced the transmission and removal rates. Subsequently, factors like newer births, migration, death due to causes other than the epidemic, as Dr. Gautam Menon was talking about it, death due to comorbidities, death due to other diseases and other factors, and of course, the factor of endemicity were accommodated. One of the key findings of the KMK model or the KMK 1932 paper makes clear observations on immigration and newer births. An observation reads as what you see on the screen. Increase of the immigration rate or of the birth rate results in an increase in the rate of infection of the healthy individuals and also in the percentage rate of infection, the percentage of risk, and in the percentage mortality from the disease. The seminal significance of KMK theory in the fields of theoretical and modeling epidemiology has been well realized, and the papers of the duo were republished as late as 1991. Lowell Reed, a public health exponent and the out-of-box researcher, credited to have coined the term biostatistics, along with physician Wade Hampton Frost, put forth the chain binomial stochastic model in 1928. The Reed-Frost model, as it is called, described the evolution of an infection in generations, and that is what you find there. With advancements in all disciplines of tangible sciences and with intermingling of knowledge and knowledge bases, several epidemiological forecasting models and projection frameworks have been developed. Random variable models, deterministic compartmental models, agent-based models, and computational models are currently being used.
Excuse
With
me,
more,
madam.
yeah,
Madam, your presentation, it's still showing the first slide. For some
my God,
reason,
I do not know. I have moved and I'm able to see that. Please
ma'am,
check.
I think the screen which has got shade is not the one where you're flipping the slides.
No, let me check. This is the screen.
Yes, ma'am. Now the one that you're presenting from has come to the sharing.
Which has come? Is it the presentation, or
Yes, ma'am. Now you had
I'll
unshared,
stop
no? Yes.
and then restart? I'll stop and restart. Please tell me. Are you able to see now? Are you able to see now?
Not yet, madam.
No, but then I'm on share and it says you're sharing. StreamYard is sharing, it says. No, but everyone can see. It says sharing.
Yes, ma'am. Now it has come, ma'am.
What has come? The screen has come. I just want to know if what is being seen there, because I'm not able to see anything now.
The browser, madam.
Now,
Yes, ma'am. Now you can just make it full screen. We'll be able to.
yeah. So I'll rapidly retrace, not go into the details. This is where we were talking about the importance of forecasting, and whatever path that is being taken by the earlier researchers, the starting of epidemic forecasting, use of mathematical models, by Ronald Ross for study of malaria, and the breakthrough in mathematical forecasting by the KMK model, the SIR model, and the various compartments, the importance of critical density, and the mention of the immigration rate by the KMK model, the later models which spoke of infection by generations, the Reed-Frost model, and this is where we were when we stopped. Various factors have been charted now, and all this is now history. The basic reproduction number, or the R naught, the endemic steady state, or the state in which the infectious disease is sustained in a population. And this is what Dr. Menon was talking about, or even Dr. Sanjeevi was talking about. There is a possibility that increase in vaccination at some point of time would make the disease endemic, and without the need for external input or extraneous introduction, a steady state could be maintained. Age of infection, or the stationary age distribution, where individuals younger to the age of infection will be susceptible and those older will be immune. Introduction of the disease through immigration, increase in susceptibility factor due to newer births, deaths due to causes other than the disease, and the effect of other causes on the recovery potential of the susceptible and infected population. When Kermack and McKendrick put forth their mathematical theory of epidemics, they subgrouped the fixed population into three: the susceptible, the infected, and the recovered. The recovered subsequently became the removed population. Removal can either be by recovery or by death, and this model assumed that the recovered group cannot get reinfected again or transmit to others. One of the lessons that COVID-19 taught us is that the recovered group can be reinfected several times for various reasons. The SIR model was subsequently modified and added to. The SIS model is built on the condition that there is no immunity upon recovery. Of course, many of us know in COVID-19, the SIS model is not operational. There is some amount of immunity, maybe transient even, but then there is some immunity left. But SIS model will come into the picture when there is no immunity upon recovery, and gradually all susceptible individuals will become infected at some point of time. The SIRD model, susceptible, infected, recovered, and dead, where the recovered and the deceased are accounted for separately, has been one of the most important models currently used. The SIRV model accounts for vaccination. There are other models which factor in newer births. S stands for susceptible here, E stands for exposed. There can be a group of individuals who are exposed to the pathogen or the organism, say for example, people exposed to COVID, but still not showing symptoms of infection and still not showing infectiousness in them. They could just remain exposed but not transmit the disease to others. So that would lead to the SEIR model. And if there is no immunity on recovery, it could become the SEIS model. Newer births would account for the maternal immunity factor, of which we are not aware at this point of time in COVID-19. There had been some studies in the United States where it has been noticed that pregnant women have been protected better by vaccination. And if this had confirmed a kind of a transmissible immunity is yet to be studied. As of now, mathematical epidemiology has acquired larger dimensions. With the entry of the novel coronavirus, forecasting and modeling strategies gained global and universal significance. R naught, all of us know, became the universal anthem. Day by day, people became interested in forecast projections. Epidemic forecasting acquired dimensions of weather forecasting, and hourly bulletins came to be issued. In short, the discipline of mathematical epidemiology has made an unforeseen trajectory. The advantage of utilizing mathematical models in the forecast of disease progression is too well known. However, for the future, it is necessary that we remember various factors of variability and what could be these factors. Factor one would be differential contact rate. The contact rate is not the same at all places and at all times. In places where the geographical terrain warrants natural social distancing, the contact rate is naturally low. This factor is an apparent advantage in a natural control of the spread of the disease. And we do see that is what happened in Kerala during the first wave, where the natural terrain has given the advantage of social distancing and physical distancing, the rate of infection was much low. However, the same can turn into a disadvantage when the spread is large and rapid, as most of the population is unexposed and becomes susceptible at a later point of time. A differential contact rate acquires greater importance in diseases where the contact is likely to be seasonal. Now, even in a disease like COVID-19, the differential contact rate would play a role, and that is what we are worried about when the schools and colleges open, where the contact rate could increase. The force of infection in such cases becomes proportional to the varying contact rate. The intermission of low outbreak oscillations can be explained, and complacence during the epidemic pseudo periods avoided if forecasting would account for this varying contact rate. Differential contact rate also gains significance in super spreader events, since super spreader events can trigger emergencies. Forecast modeling can go a long way in effective preparedness of the healthcare system. The second factor would be accounting for spatiotemporal compartments. In other words, instead of numbers, on the left of the screen, you find the numbers in a compartment, but then on the right, you find the density. By making the compartments spatiotemporal, non-pharmaceutical interventions like physical distancing, masking behavior, influence of natural conditions like ventilation, all these can be included. Forecasting, therefore, will become eco-specific and zone-specific. The provision for spatiotemporal compartments will not only improve forecasting quality in existing situations, but will also account for immigration, newer or renewed introduction of the disease. As we find the disease coming in spurts or waves, a renewed migration of the waves, or a renewed introduction of newer variants. The advantage of spatiotemporal compartments in forecasting is manifold. Let me remind you, prior to COVID-19 pandemic, the other pandemic that shook the earth was the 1918 Spanish flu. And why? During the Spanish flu and research later, several people argued that the Spanish flu spread only to and in countries where there was troop movement. And it really was not a true pandemic. But then please remember what the KMK model said in 1932, increase of the immigration rate. Occurrence of immigration, introduction of an infectious or a carrier individual through immigration into a susceptible population, increase in the contact rate and contact profile due to a cross-country and international travel, repetitive contact, and mixed contact are some of the difficulties that current predictions face. A spatio-temporal dynamic model may conveniently include many of these parameters and predict a reasonably stable forecast. The third of variable would be the subpopulation dynamics. Variability parameters in subpopulations. Subpopulations may be exclusive or interactive. You can have the adult versus infant, elderly versus young, men versus women, mobile versus stationary. Someone keeps going about, from inside the house, keeps going out for shopping, for so many other reasons, to office and so on, and someone else remains inside the house. There could be a kind of interaction between the subpopulations, and these can change the epidemic profile. COVID-19 made all the healthcare professionals in general and the epidemiologists in particular think of the subpopulations, levels of the possible and probable interactions between the subpopulations, and the influence of viral factors on these subpopulations. Maybe not only human subpopulations can be kept in mind, the immunostable subpopulation of the human compartment can be juxtaposed to the immunocompromised subpopulation, but then subpopulation dynamics of the organism factors can also be studied in this model. Dynamic models can provide dynamic forecasting. Now, when we think of subpopulation, think of limited access to vaccination, think of the variants of concern, think of the various possibilities of mutation in the organism itself. Now, all these are possible in mathematical modeling, but then there is one factor which needs to be remembered. Dr. Gautam Menon was talking about the importance of granular statistics in mathematical modeling. Yes, it is very, very essential to have input data, and the quality of input data should be high. Epidemic forecasting is generally thought to be tough. And in times to come, it will become tougher and tougher. And why? Because population and subpopulations are not stationary. COVID-19 has taught us the spread of the disease in the initial phases was because of international travel and introduction of infectious people into a susceptible subpopulation. Travel, migration, mobility will all contribute to this difficult situation. We should also remember organisms become more intelligent. It is survival of the virus that more and more mutations happen. Of course, some of these mutations and some of the variants may not be of importance at all. However, organisms will continue to become more and more intelligent and mutate further. Human behavior keeps changing. Now, all these variables make epidemic forecasting tougher and tougher. At the same time, epidemic forecasting is becoming better and better because intricate details of behavior adaptability can be included. Population dynamics is understood better. There is an interdisciplinary approach. Open data sources are available, making demographic and geographic data available to many. Epidemic forecasting and predictive models will become more significant in the days to come. And why so? Please remember, there will be more epidemics. It is not that the virus would disappear. There was a question as to what is a wave in an epidemic. Let us remember, any epidemic, there would be more and more waves. Will there be a third wave or a fourth wave or a fifth wave? Go and stand at the seashore. There will be waves. But it all depends if the wave is going to be a low wave or the wave with a larger hump or a taller hump. There will definitely be waves, and the dictum that modeling will have to teach us is that higher the contact, higher the hump, lower the contact, lower the hump. Viruses cannot disappear from the face of Earth. There will be newer organisms, more lethal organisms. Comorbidities and lifestyle changes will complicate the situation. Vaccination and immunization techniques will improve. And overall, there will be a collective responsibility which the models would educate. My request to those of you who are involved in modeling, we in the Tamil Nadu Dr. MGR Medical University were also involved in projection studies. Of course, the input data that we had the advantage of being a medical university, and we were able to include a lot of granular clinical data, and our projection studies had been fairly accurate. However, I'm not here to say about those studies, but then out of experience that was gained during those studies, I would only request those of you who are involved in predictive modeling include more subpopulations, include factors of adjuvant therapy. COVID 19 saw the inclusion of Indian systems of medicine. Several Indian concoctions and formulations were used as adjuvant therapy in COVID 19 management. Now, did these factors alter the situation? What was the influence of these factors? Kindly include factors of adjuvant therapy, include vaccination strategies while working on predictive models, also include specific factors like antigenic sin. All along, we've been saying vaccination in COVID 19 accords a kind of protection. Yes, it does. Of course, vaccination does not prevent infection. Someone could get infected even after vaccination. But then there had also been sporadic reports where booster vaccination has aggravated the host reaction. There is a minimal possibility that there could be something called the antigenic sin, which is causing this exaggerated host response, especially when boosters are being used. Whether antigenic sin occurs only in those with comorbidities or even in those with a baseline stable health needs to be worked out and studied further. Similarly, most of the vaccines which are available for COVID 19 as of now do not differentiate between the variants at all. I don't think so. Any new vaccine has come which is specifically against the Delta variant or the Delta plus variant. Almost all the vaccines were thought of in the beginning, and they kind of accord protection for the basic variant model. That is all. So probably in future, variable factors like variants of concern and their makeup will also have to be included in predictive modeling. I would only request that more variable factors are included in the agent-based models and in the multi-network models so that we would be able to utilize predictive modeling as a device for decision making and for healthcare preparedness in any pandemic, not only in COVID, but then as pandemics are regular to occur, let us be prepared with our predictive modeling techniques. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Sudha. Madam, it was a pleasure hearing to you once again for all of us, because we heard you recently when you came for the memorial talk. And like always, you have been able to give us a right perspective on the topic. Thank you once again, madam, for giving your valuable time.
Thank you.
Sairam.
If there is a few minutes, if I can ask Madam a few questions.
Yes, sir. Please do.
Greetings, Madam. How are you doing? This is Anuj
I'm
Mumbai
good.
from.
Thank you. Thank you. How are you, Anuj?
I am very well. I live in US in Arizona, but right now visiting my parents here in India, Kanpur. Well, very interesting. I think you have covered such a historical perspective, starting from the very background and giving us the latest field, what we are looking for in the COVID, for example, in pandemic. Beautiful perspective, because many times we think about current models and we forget about the history can teach us so many good things. And we can learn quite a lot. So thank you very much for this lovely talk. But my
Thank you, and
question is
welcome.
regarding, how do you see, is the pandemic has done any changes from the way people are looking, especially your school is a medical school. How are scientists in medical school are seeing the mathematical model, and how the collaborations have increased or remains the same? Can you draw the some idea about how is mathematical?
Anuj, until recently, I don't think so. People at the medical school were even thinking about mathematics. The very mention of the word mathematics was a terror to people in the medical fraternity. But then, COVID, as it has taught us many things, it has taught us that mathematics can still be part of a medical education, and predictive models based on mathematical epidemiology can make wonders. The
Yeah.
perspective has changed.
Yeah, well, it is very clear the way you gave the talk. It was, I mean, it was crystal clear what you are looking at as a head of the institution, as the medical institutions, and of course, if your thinking is like that, I'm sure that other in your organizations are thinking along the same lines. So, I mean, it is a good. I mean, there are, of course, there are lots of problems happens due to COVID, but these are the good things, few good things that COVID has initiated.
Yes, I suppose so.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And we would like to continue further, maybe sharing some modeling work with your group, your institution's researcher in future. And I personally would like to be in touch with you and continue discussing on a potential collaborations. Actually.
Sure, sure, Anuj. And probably a little while from now, Dr. Srinivas, our head of epidemiology, would be joining in and would be sharing our experiences.
Okay. Jai Shri Ram.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sairam.
Sai Ram.
Thank you, madam. Thank you, Dr. Anuj. We will now have a small break. We will reconvene at 11:15. I repeat, we will reconvene at 11:15. Thank you. Yes. Sairam, and welcome back. To continue the series of talks, we now have a keynote address by Dr. Srinivas. Dr. G. Srinivas is the professor and HOD in Dr. MGR Medical University. He did his MBBS and MD in community medicine. He has postgraduate teaching experience of 11 years and extensive research and project management experience. He is a member of Governing Council member of Senate and a Senate member, the TN Dr. MGR Medical University. He is also a member of Indian Clinical Epidemiological Network. He was awarded first prize in phytochemical validation of Siddha classical drug Parangi Rasayanam at the World Congress on Holistic Health International Conference. He also taught tropical diseases, leprosy, TB, Burulai ulcer at the Institute of Tropical Medicine and International Health in Berlin, Germany from 2011 to 2014 for the Masters in International Health course. He led and organized 25 plus workshops in research methods, evidence-based medicine, scientific writing, and statistical softwares in health. Dr. Srinivas will be talking to us on India's efforts to combat current pandemic and miniature experience of the Tamil Nadu Dr. MGR Medical University in forecasting the COVID-19 outbreak through SIRD modeling. I now invite Dr. Srinivas to address the gathering. Thank you.
So, Sairam, good morning everyone. And am I audible? How is my video and audio?
It's all fine, sir.
Fantastic, thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for the very interesting opportunity. And I also like to say that probably you have taken my CV from where I need to edit it. I'm no more a governing council member of the university. So, just for information. And thanks anyway for this opportunity. I'll go to the slides. Now, my talk will be something more of our country's response to the current pandemic. And I'll try to give some brief outline about the epidemiological factors, the epidemiological terms, as well as our experience with the SIRD modeling from the medical side. Now, with regard to the burden of epidemics, I'm sure the word epidemic was not so familiar before. The term, the Department of Epidemiology, whenever people ask, where are you working? When I say them, I'm working in Department of Epidemiology, people will not even recognize the word epidemiology. They used to think it's something not related to medicine or something. But once they saw this epidemic and the pandemic, the word became very familiar to all, and they have started understanding more. They equate it in terms of study of epidemiology. Study of epidemics is as epidemiology, but epidemiology is something more, study of distribution of the disease, study of determinants of the disease, and as well as epidemic is one of the multiple terms in epidemics. And we know epidemic, outbreak, endemic, pandemic, lot of words. And slowly people have understood it much better than the epidemiologists. So that's about the burden of epidemics. The epidemic events globally for the years 2011 to 2017, for the 6 years when we try to understand globally, you'll see in this slide, across the world, in fact, almost 150 plus countries were reporting almost about 5 to 10 or more than 10 epidemics in a year. This is the distribution across the world, and in particular, you would be seeing pointer here. So in India in particular, there have been 13 episodes of epidemic between 2011 and 2017. So for all practical purposes, epidemic is an outbreak, and a localized outbreak is the terminology preferred by the epidemiologist. And when the epidemic is occurring in many countries across the world, then the WHO declares it as pandemic. And this slide gives you indication that almost no country is spared from epidemic. And particularly the COVID infection did not spare any country, including the richest countries. In fact, the the cost they paid for the disease was much more than the developing countries. And in short, a total of 1,300 plus epidemic events in 172 countries during this period of 2011 to 2017. And what it means is what types of diseases we see. In fact, it's a wide range of epidemic diseases, starting from yellow fever, which we don't see in India. In fact, for various reasons, India is immune against yellow fever. It's very common in African countries. But as such, you'll be seeing that cholera is a major epidemic in India during this time period of study. And also we see meningitis here coming up. Then we also see typhoid fever. We also see many other illnesses. The 21st century already has a long series of menaces, both emerging diseases and re-emerging diseases. SARS in particular was introduced in 21st century. Before that, we didn't hear the term as SARS. And it was in 2003, we saw it as a new disease called severe acute respiratory distress, killing about 1 in 10 of them, which is 20% mortality, or 10 to 20% mortality. So minimum was 10% mortality. In 2009, we had H1N1, which was a pandemic in fact. In fact, it was not a localized epidemic. It was a pandemic created in the first influenza pandemic of the 21st century. 2012 and 13, we had Middle East respiratory syndrome, again an epidemic. Then Zika virus in 2015, mainly caused by Aedes aegypti mosquito. There are different types of mosquito, and Aedes aegypti mosquito is a day-biting mosquito, and it is very common across the world, including developed countries. And it causes microcephaly, which means small brain. And this is a dreadful disease, causes brain damage among unborn babies. In 2017, not plague, which was a ancient disease. In 18th century and 19th century, they had a lot of plague cases, which became common in 2017. It's not only pneumonic plague, which is a lung-involved plague. There's also lymph node-involved bubonic plague. What it means is, in the 21st century, we are not only seeing the new diseases like SARS, we are also seeing diseases like old diseases like cholera, plague, yellow fever, often return. The old diseases often return, and new ones immediately arrive to join them. We had almost 40 outbreaks of cholera alone reported to WHO every year. There are probably some more to come, or many more to come, but most of the global intertropical zone has the highest density of Aedes disease, the transport disease. So this will be a big role for modeling. Now this talks about the various time frames. What we see is 2003 SARS, H1N1 pandemic in 2009, as well as the latest pandemic, COVID-19 in 2019 or 2020. 2020 onwards practically, though it is last few months of 2019. Now this epidemic is a very common phenomena, and we are turned into a pandemic, though many epidemics occur, but not everyone turns into a pandemic. And pandemic, it is pan means all and demos means people, and it's declared by WHO. Lesson here is that over time, diseases very rarely disappear, and there always seems to be room for new ones. Probably many more to come, as Vice Chancellor Madam was mentioning. There are many more expected, but to what extent they will burden us depends upon our response to the infections. Now, with regard to the epidemic phases, because this is what was being discussed at the beginning of the epidemic, especially whether community transmission was happening. Very common question was being asked whether India has gone to community transmission phase, which is supposed to be like stage 3. Usually, because of this One Health concept, where animal, man, and even environment, there are a lot of changes, mainly the lifestyle changes impacts all three, which causes a lot of scope for new pandemics. And the anticipation is very important, because we need to, once the new agent or the re-emerging agent is introduced, the health system should anticipate, detect the cases early. Fast detection will be important. Early detection is important, and have different phases like localized transmission, where we have containment, or it amplifies, has a lot of community transmission, where control and mitigation measures are important. And ultimately, after 3 to 4 years, generally, the microorganisms have their waning phase, and they go for elimination or eradication. Glossary of terms, eradication, I am sure, is an epidemiological term. Possibly smallpox is the only disease which we have eradicated. Permanent reduction to zero of the worldwide incidence of infection caused by a specific agent as a result of deliberate efforts. and intervention measures are no longer needed, though there are lab samples of smallpox in Russia and other places. Now, this is in smallpox. There has been a good modeling exercise done. I'm sure some of you would be familiar with this, especially what role the herd immunity played in control of smallpox, and what role the vaccination played in control of smallpox. A lot of interesting calculations, as we also have it for other diseases like rubella, measles. Extinction is a word which you use in epidemiology for a infectious agent becomes no longer exists in the nature or in the laboratory. In eradication, the infectious agent is there in the laboratory, but in extinction phase, the agent doesn't even occur even in the laboratory. But there is no example to quote. But generally, what we have to understand is the microorganisms, once they come to the environment, they try to adapt and they try to live. The outlivers is different, but they try to live. Control is a term which means reduction of disease incidence, disease prevalence, disease morbidity, and mortality to a locally acceptable level of the result of deliberate efforts. Continued intervention measures are required to maintain the reduction. An example is classically diarrheal diseases. Elimination of disease is something that we have a good example of neonatal tetanus, and where the reduction to zero incidence of suicide disease in a defined geographical area as a result of deliberate efforts. But however, continued intervention measures are required. The best example is neonatal tetanus. And here we need to understand the difference between disease and infection. Infection is something, the introduction of the infectious agent into the body, but the disease is when the introduced infectious agent develops into signs and symptoms. So this is like symptomatic COVID infection. This is like the COVID infection has entered our body but is asymptomatic. But they are also part of period of communicability. They can transmit the infections. The example we have here is measles and polio. So practically speaking, except in 2 or 3 countries, poliomyelitis is eradicated like this. This is a photograph which people of 4 or 5 decades really will be remembering, like the smallpox which was eradicated in 1980. So this is eradicated now, and this is neonatal tetanus, where is the opisthotonous position, where the baby goes for severe flash spasms. Now coming to very specifically to COVID cases as of yesterday, what we see is the world, the population is about 7.9 billion. And India's population is about 1.4 billion. Just practically speaking, every 6th human being in the world is an Indian, and every 5th human being in the world is a Chinese. Now, with this amount of 1.3 billion population, we have been able to see that almost for every 1 million population, for every 10 lakh population, about almost 5 lakh tests have been conducted, which is a huge number. For a country of our size, to have about 5 lakh tests being done for about 1 million population, there may be some multiple tests, but as such, on average, almost every second person in India has got it tested for RT-PCR. Now, the tested, we have to see that for every 1 million population, we have about 24,000 cases, and we have a total of 3.4 crore cases so far. And the deaths has been 4.5 lakhs. The total deaths across the world is about 50 lakhs. And as you remember, the Spanish flu, which was a major epidemic in the last century, in 1922, the Spanish flu had caused almost 5 crore deaths, about 50 million deaths. So that is the level of fatality with regard to Spanish flu. But as such, even though there will be some undercounting, practically speaking, maybe 1:2 or 1:3 times. So we may be anywhere between 1 to 2 crore of deaths so far globally. Accounting for those are not counted. But as such, still the corona epidemic is not over, so we will not be able to say much. But as such, as of date, the Spanish flu is a major pandemic, what we have seen in the past 120 years. And other countries have also done extremely well. But USA, for its population of just 33 crores, see the impact. Though they have done more tests, the number of cases is more, the number of deaths are more. But as such, India is much better in its compared response against COVID. Now, with regard to these figures, which you may be well aware about, last 7-day average has come down after our hectic second wave in the month of April and May. We have gradually stabilized, and as such, we are seeing an average about 400 plus deaths on a day. This is 7-day moving average. 346 was the last week's average, and the peak is about, we are seeing about a high number of deaths, about 4,000 across. This was in May and July. And Southeast Asia in general, particularly Malaysia and in particular, have kept COVID-19 deaths per million of population very low compared to countries where pandemic broke out at the same time. So we have about 300 deaths approximately, even though it is undercounted. 300 deaths per million population is very low when compared to almost 2,000 to 3,000 deaths across the Western countries like US and other countries. So 300 per million versus almost 2,500 plus per million in the other countries. So let's keep this in mind. And possibly the low death rate is hypothesized for different factors. One is the age pyramid. We have a lot of younger age group, and our median age is about 27 or 26. So 50% of the population are below 26 years. In Western world, it is more than 50 years. So practically, we have a age structure benefit. Then we have more rural population, so density is less. The temperature may be a factor, and other immunity in general is maybe a factor. Food may be a factor, etc., etc. And of course, considering the intervention measures, practically we had a yearly lockdown, which also could have been contributed. Public health measures, as you all know, that we are one of the earliest had the earliest lockdown in the country. Started from March 2020. In fact, even schools in our state, in Tamil Nadu in particular, what was closed for first to eighth standard in March 2020 is just about to open in the first week of November. So almost they had a 18-month break, the schools up to eighth standard, and even from 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th standard, they have not worked for more than 2 months in the past 18 months. And the country was divided into different zones. We had a very good containment measures. Testing was rapidly expanded. The phone app was introduced. We had a network of COVID care hospitals, health centers, and a very systematic referral system being established for a country of countries. Laboratory network was massively expanded. We had too many labs, testing capacity of almost 1.2 million per day. And national serological surveys are conducted. We had conducted about 2 major surveys by ICMR to understand the antibodies level of the population. We also had promoted the traditional medicine of antivirals and immunomodulators. A lot of research is going on Kapasar Kudinir and other Siddha products. And India's performance was in general good. And our recovery rate continued to be steadily better. And death rate has been steadily falling, and currently very less, in fact, when compared to other countries. Lockdown, I don't have to mention this. You know all the advantages of closing the borders, etc., etc., in the early phase of the thing. And the so-called social distancing was promoted. Masking behavior was adopted. Though considerable people have not used the mask, but still, when compared to Western world, generally there was a the attitude was positive for the wearing of masks and other behaviors, good appropriate behaviors. The Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker, which assessed the countries on key policies implemented by the government, gave a very high score in the beginning of the initial months in the first wave. So we had a lot to learn in the second wave, but in the first wave, as such, India did extremely well when compared to other Western countries. So a lot of preparedness package response. So we had a high number of beds. We also had district management, hospital management information system. We had teleconsultation platforms. We also had a high number of oxygen storage tanks, high number of ICU beds being mobilized, extra ambulances being innovated in the sense, a lot of special vehicles are promoted for ambulances. And as such, the establishment of robot healthcare system with the digital focus on digital care, telemedicine, and other things emerged as a promising. And to address insufficient staff in COVID, non-COVID health setups, telemedicine was promoted, which emerged as a useful tool for quality care provision in rural and remote areas. More hospital beds, pediatric intensive care units emergency procedures were strengthened. We also had oxygen carriers, oxygen storage capacities, and also ICUs were strengthened in this phase. Access to diagnostic testings and a lot of things became limited, and the best guidelines were dynamic. Though the guidelines were dynamic, practically there are experts being constituted, and they were keep on changing the guidelines. So it was not only a universal phenomena. That chloroquine was tried. We had different hypotheses being hypothesized, but still it was very dynamic, and very good medical care team was being present. What we want to summarize here is we are actually building to a more stable and steady health system, and COVID has helped us to strengthen our health system in India. Whether COVID is there or no, long COVID is there or not, it will be good for the future for control of other diseases and other pandemics. And India, is now running the world's largest vaccine campaign, and we have very recently crossed 1 billion vaccine doses so far. The program just started in January, mid of January, and people did not expect us to perform so well. And though we also have shared before the second wave the vaccine production to 95 other countries, and our vaccine production capacity is so high that we will be able to have 100 doses will be produced in the fourth quarter of this year. So what was 30 crore doses in the month of October, into 3, we can make 90 to 100 crores in the fourth quarter of this year. And our pharmaceutical industries has produced a lot of cost-effective COVID diagnostic kits, drugs, medical devices, and PPE kits, provide affordable options for many developing countries. And we have seen even South Africa and Brazil getting a lot of products from us, and that's in pandemic the response required by a country. We cannot work in isolation, and we work for other countries too. And this data, I'm sure you would have seen it. Recently, what we have understood is almost the partial, more than about 50% have been partially one dose vaccination, partially vaccinated in India, and about 20 to 30% have been fully vaccinated. And the numbers are here, and generally, performance was astonishing for us. And what we see here is that generally across the world, UAE, Singapore, Canada had almost 80 to 70% of full production. But among the countries, India has also done extremely well as compared to a few of the countries here: Sri Lanka, Germany, India, and Russia. And now I'm just focusing on the epidemiological modeling, which is the focus for most of you. The transmission mechanism from an infective to susceptible is understood for nearly all infectious diseases, and the spread of disease through a chain of infection is well known. This is the medical part. So the transmission dynamics is well known, especially for non-infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases. Nothing much is known. We just call it the risk factors. But with regard to the infectious diseases, the communicable diseases, it is the agent factors are well established. The transmission mode of transmission, the infectious period, the incubation period, the period of communicability, and a lot of other factors related to the agent, the infectious agent. It may be a bacteria, it may be a virus, it may be a parasite, because this is clear. But the transmission interaction in the population are very complex. So it is difficult to comprehend the large dynamics of a disease spread without the formal structure of a mathematical model. And as somebody was asking before this session, because even we have been very averse against the mathematics as such, not just the modeling, but as such, what we have understood in this epidemic, in this pandemic period is this mathematical model, how you are using experiments with experimental infectious diseases spread in human population to predict the macroscopic behavior of the spread through a population. And experiments with infectious diseases are not impossible, or unethical, or inexpensive. We won't be able to conduct a clinical trial or a randomized control trial to understand what does the infectious agent does to the body. But you'll be able to simulate the model, and data is sometimes available from naturally occurring epidemics or from natural instances of endemic diseases. Data is often incomplete. We know the quality of data is noisy, but mainly because of underreporting or other reasons. And as such, we have some data to work with and to simulate the model and get some outcomes. The lack of reliable data makes accurate parameter estimation difficult, so that it may only be possible to estimate a range of value of some parameters. And accurate data are usually not available in epidemiology. Mathematically can be performed and it can be adjusted for in the models. The population considered, we know these numbers like the constant size, the population we use the great range, the capital N, which is sufficiently large so that the size each class can be considered as a continuous variable. So it's a very important assumption in the epidemiological model. The population considered has a constant size which is sufficiently large so that size of each class can be considered, because we compartmentalize to different groups. It may be SIRD or SCRD or whatever be the different compartments. There should be a considerable size sample size so that the data will be somewhat precise and reliable. The model is to include vital dynamics, then it is assumed that births and natural deaths are occurring at equal rates and all newborns are susceptible. The second assumption is the population is homogeneously mixing. The daily contact rate is the average number of adequate contacts per infected per day, and the contact is an interaction which results in infection that the other is susceptible. We also assume that always the population is homogeneously mixing, which may not be the reality, but we need to make these assumptions so that the models work. And individuals recover or removed and the infectivity rate at a constant rate, the proportionality constant called daily recovery removal rate. This may be due to recovery or may be due to death. So we may have to do this analysis. If recovery does not give immunity, then the model is called SAS model. Since individuals move from susceptible class to the infected class, and then they back to the susceptible class. The individual recovers the permanent immunity, and it is called the SAR model. So this is an important division which we understood only after this pandemic. So the SAS model and the SAR model difference of how the susceptibility and recovery changes the design. The SAR models are generally appropriate for viral agents such as measles, mumps, smallpox, and very specifically for rubella also. And the calculations have been very precise in understanding at what level of herd immunity the rubella disease can be controlled. Such things we have not been able to do it for the COVID virus for various reasons, but as such, this can come in the near future. The SAS model applied for some practical diseases like meningitis, plague, and venereal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, and for protozoal diseases like malaria and sleeping sickness. The epidemiological models assume population being considered as uniform and homogeneous in mixing. However, most infectious diseases actually spread in a diverse or dispersed population. As I mentioned in the previous slide, it is decided to consider population divided into different subpopulation. And this is the classification of agent in the epidemiologically. The viral diseases like measles, chickenpox, rubella, smallpox, polio, and including our COVID, they are from person to person, human to human transmission. So this we using SAR model. But these things, this may not be an appropriate thing. So now this is using a vector. The vector can be can be a mosquito, can be some insect, like yellow fever, dengue fever, and sandfly fever. Sandfly fever, the vector is a sandfly. And from person to reservoir, this is from dogs to person, that is a rabies virus. And for bacteria also we have a classification. And person to environment is typhoid fever, which is very common epidemic. And of course we also have plague, where the rats have an important role to play. And protozoa, we have malaria and trypanosomiasis. Malaria, the mosquito is important insect as a vector. We also have some other helminthic diseases. The four factors that go into the R naught, which you are much familiar than as the dots we call duration, opportunity, transmission, and susceptibility. And duration is the length of time as the person who gets the virus infectious. The COVID is thought to be up to 5 to 14 days. So this is not to be confused with the incubation period. Incubation is the period which may or may not be infectious, but period of communicability is the period of infected period, which may come even last after the symptoms have started. The incubation period stops once the symptom starts, but period of communicability may extend beyond the starting of signs and symptoms. So we need to be very clear. Depending upon the disease, this may change. This is a clinical information which you need to account for while building the models. And the second component, opportunity, is the amount of social interactions a typical infectious person has to result in virus passing on to another person. And transmission is the value, the dots, the third component, T, how likely an interaction between infectious and uninfected person results in the virus being passed on to the second person. Every interaction resulted in a new infection, this would be enormous. So half of the interaction resulted in the virus passing can probably be 50%. Susceptibility is the last component. How much immunity depends upon the vaccination and other herd immunity factors, and this also has to be accounted for. In simple terms, we have this, and this is a rule of contagion given by the Adam theory, built by London School of Hygiene. So these factors, and to bring down the R naught, duration of infectiousness, here depends upon whether we have a treatment, whether we have intervention, whether we have antibiotic. So this usually we will not be able to do much in viral diseases. The opportunity, of course, depends upon the distancing and followed, not followed, mask, COVID appropriate, followed or not followed. That is considered in the opportunity. Transmission also talks about social distancing and practicing personal hygiene. And so these are the factors which are practically epidemiological factors, which has to be accounted for in the modeling. And I'll just briefly go through the SARD model, which, sorry for this SARD model. We had a customized basic reproduction data estimated per day infection based on the mortality and recovery rates. The purpose of the analysis was to determine the hospitalization needs for the state for COVID management. And we started this exercise in the month of April, May, and we used the minimal data of daily available data and also add some information about the clinical profile. As BC Madam was mentioning, the clinical data about the asymptomatic rates, like 80% were asymptomatic then in the first wave, about 20% need hospitalization. Of the 20%, which is about of 95%, only 5% of the overall infection rate needed ICU. Of the 5%, only 3% needed oxygen, and of the 3%, 1% needed ventilator. So we had all this clinical profile information which we adopted. Therefore, we also further aim to forecast the pattern of progression of COVID pandemic in Tamil Nadu. The model was simulated for the entire Tamil Nadu, the state of 77 million population. The simulation showed a trend of infection that could occur in different scenarios. The actual data was reported, and the three parameters we considered, and I'm sure Madam has gone through this R naught basic reproduction numbers, and R naught greater than 1 is epidemic and less than 1 is slowly dying out, equal to 1 is endemic, and possibly we are in this stage now. 1 or little just below 1. And I'm not going to go through these notations, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, the rate of transmission, the rate of time factor, but the population is stable overall in general. And this is, and there are some notations. And various notations like change of time, T, and the various fractions of population in the class generated by the changes in time with regard to the recovery, susceptibility, and the infection rate. And we got the support from the biostatistician, and we used the ggplot techniques and also the TSOL packages, and we used R software. Possibly the daily data available from the media bulletin, we had used it, and we had tried to project it. And at that point of time, to be for honest, we were feeling that different universities were coming up with different numbers. Cambridge University was coming with different numbers, something from UK, something from US, something from ICMR. And so we also thought we are also just putting up some numbers and going to get out some output. But actually speaking, to our surprising fact, these things, I'm sure you are much familiar with this, I'm not going to touch this. But what was surprising is, in the month of May, when we tried to work this model, from the month of June, we were able to see the outputs. Practically speaking, the infectivity rate was almost precise for about next 15 days. And the number of deaths was also almost precise. The numbers, we are not worried about the numbers as such, though the press was interested in getting the numbers and telling that lakhs will be infected, so many deaths will happen. And there were some information from the different stakeholders that we are trying to create panic among the public. But our focus was not on estimating the deaths or estimating the infections. Our focus was mainly on understanding these things: the ventilator needs, the ICU beds, the high pressure oxygen needs, the critical beds, and adjusting with the actuals. What is the number of things expected per day requirements for the state? This we did for Chennai, which had almost 75 lakh population. We also did it for Tamil Nadu, which had about 7.7 crore population. Now, we had some restrictions and limitations, but generally the R0 was a very important determinant for all these factors. And the R0 was very dynamic. In fact, the R0 was fluctuating for once in 5 days or once in 8 days, practically speaking. And when you try to play with the R0 once in 2 weeks, we had relatively stable measures, just precisely figuring out or projecting the next 15 days outcome. Now, these are the information we got it from literature. For example, proportion of COVID patients who are asymptomatic based on the age structure of the population, what proportion is going to be symptomatic, what proportion is hospitalization. We used all these figures. We tried to project these things for the state as well as for the city. We also worked for different municipalities in Chengalpet, like Pallavaram and Chengalpet sub-panchayat level also we did it. What we understood was there are the model parameters generally evolve over time, because we also keep customizing the R0 according to the data, because the data is not very quality data, I should say. It was very noisy data. So practically speaking, suddenly after 2 to 3 months, we get the information that 400 deaths are added in the database. They have missed it in the corporation. So therefore, the parameters to get stabilized, it takes some time. And time series plot data shows a regional variation. And the national level data is not appropriate for local predictions. Or sometimes, even for a big nation like India, it is very difficult to make projections. But for a small level, for about at least from about 50 lakhs population or 1 lakh, 2 to 50 lakh population, we'll be able to make some good regional predictions. And small administrative, more informative available. And the interventions and other guidance is very important. And we need to account for all these interventions like lockdown, phase relaxation, closure of schools, the practice of appropriate behavior, COVID appropriate behavior. So these things should be considered, including migrations and dynamic clinical case investigation, dynamic reporting timelines have to be considered. Now, just last with few slides, so though I'm running short of time, I'll try to take up these things. It is even more complicated with regard to the herd immunity. Practically, the herd immunity adjustments have been studied well for viral diseases like rubella, measles, etc. Possibly, we have to do a lot of work in corona and understand what is the role of herd immunity. Though vaccination is going in such a massive thing that, practically speaking, almost India is expected to have about 80 to 90% population being covered with first dose. And these modelings are very interestingly, I found out, especially in the school closures were deployed rapidly across China and Hong Kong. However, there are no data on the relative contribution of these measures. Data from SARS outbreak in mainland China suggests that school closures did not contribute to the control of epidemic. So practically, these sort of studies are very useful. We need to figure out, especially closing down to some important interventions, closing down the important activities. We need to understand whether it really contributes to the control of the disease or not. So recent modeling studies alone prevent only 2% of this, much less than the social distancing intervention. In general, you know that the children were less affected both in terms of infections as well as among the deaths. Though they are very important part of our population, practically speaking, they did not contribute much to the herd immunity. Possibly, if they had been infected, they had been exposed to the virus, they would have contributed more to the herd immunity. Conclusion is, the pandemic was hard hit for the country, but Indian health system have attempted to overcome the challenges, thrown their way through powerful strategies and collaborative pathways. And the burden of the disease as such, in terms of contribution of deaths also, has been very, very minimal. And particularly the vaccine development also was surprisingly, it made a very good progress. And the expected timelines for delivery was overwhelming. And most vigorous research to estimate the effect of control measures currently in many affiliates, such as school closure and other interventions, can be used for epidemic planning purposes and can be aided in modeling. But we would like to conclude that, practically speaking, we have understood that the importance of modeling, the importance of mathematical modeling, especially for these infectious diseases. And we are just a learner in the university, and we would like to collaborate with interested universities to take it further. And as such, each pandemic has got something positive. For example, plague led to the invention of quarantine. Quarantine is 40 days in Spanish. Practically, the concept of quarantine came up because of plague. And smallpox, aided in discovery of vaccine, and cholera, the discovery of public health, and this is influenza, the discovery of mask. Practically, this is, and now COVID-19. And humanity has endured many crises over centuries, and this will also pass. But we should not learn, and we should understand the contribution of the diseases in improving our health system and strengthening our health system, as well as in improving our science. And I'm sure we will try to learn more from this pandemic. And I would like to conclude with this saying of the WHO Director General: no country can end the pandemic in isolation from the rest of the world, and no country can protect the health of its own people without working to protect the health of the other people. So the scientists should work together, which for some reason you will understand, even in the vaccine we see there's a wide divide among the production of or the invention of vaccines. So we'll keep this in mind and work for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful talk. And we are sure and we are looking forward for a fruitful collaboration with the Tamil Nadu MGR University with your rich data, which you have spread across the entire Tamil Nadu. So we can surely develop mathematical models and validate the models with the data, and also the data can help further enhancing our models. Thank you, sir, for your valuable time for this talk. I would also like to thank all the speakers for this morning session and also the participants for their active involvement. We will close this morning session now, and we will have a lunch break for 2 hours, and we will all assemble back virtually at 2 p.m. sharp. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sai Ram.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Sai Ram.
Sai Ram.